My two children stood in my bedroom, pointing toward the front door. "Get out of this house right now," they shouted. They stood there completely cold and heartless. I looked at the black trash bag containing my clothes scattered on the hardwood floor. I did not scream. I did not beg. I simply picked up a worn brown envelope from my nightstand, walked out into the freezing rain, and took $50 million with me. 2 weeks later, they were on their knees begging for their lives. I am Roland Sinclair. I am 74 years old, and until recently, I believed that family was the one thing in this world you could truly rely on. For decades, I broke my back as a general contractor here in Atlanta, building a life from the ground up so my family would never have to know the struggles I endured. My late wife Beatrice and I gave our children everything we never had. We poured every ounce of our souls into their futures. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family that completely underestimated your worth. Growing up as a black man in the South, I learned early on that respect is not given, it is earned. But inside my own home, the home I built with my own two hands, respect was completely non-existent. It was a freezing Tuesday night in late November. I was sitting on the edge of my bed holding a framed photograph of Beatrice. She had passed away 5 years ago, and the house had felt too big and too empty ever since. But it was still my sanctuary. Suddenly, the bedroom door flew open with such violent force that the brass handle punched a hole straight through the drywall. There stood Chloe, my 40-year-old daughter-in-law. She is a white woman who failed miserably as a real estate agent, but still carried herself like she owned the entire city. She was the quintessential entitled woman, always dropping subtle, passive-aggressive comments about my culture, my neighborhood, and my background. She marched into my room, her face twisted in an ugly scowl, and hurled a heavy black trash bag right at my feet. The cheap plastic tore open on impact, spilling my folded shirts, my socks, and the beautiful wool sweaters Beatrice had knitted for me. "Get your things and get out," Chloe hissed. Her eyes were wide with a manic, desperate energy. "You are leaving tonight, Roland? We are absolutely done playing caretaker for a useless old man. You sit in this big house taking up space while your family is struggling. It is time for you to go to a city shelter or a state facility, somewhere meant for people like you." I knew exactly what she meant by people like you. She had been making those vile little implications for years. But before I could even ask her if she had completely lost her mind, heavy footsteps echoed rapidly down the hallway. My biological son, Darren, walked into the room. He is 45 years old, wearing a flashy designer suit he bought on a maxed-out credit card, smelling of expensive cologne he could not afford. Darren was lazy. He had run 3 different businesses into the ground, but he loved to project the image of a wealthy, successful entrepreneur on social media. Right behind him was Trent, my white son-in-law. Trent is 44, a delusional man who called himself a tech visionary, but had never actually built a single successful company. He always spoke to me with a condescending tone, as if my decades of hard labor meant nothing compared to his imaginary digital empire. Trent looked at my clothes spilled on the floor and smirked. "It is nothing personal," Old Man Trent said, leaning casually against the doorframe. "It is just business. This property is dead equity and we need liquidity right now." I remained seated on the edge of my bed. I looked directly at Darren. This was the boy I had taught to throw a baseball, the boy I had worked double shifts in the blistering Georgia heat to send to a prestigious college. Darren refused to meet my gaze. He stared blankly at the wall, shifting his weight from foot to foot. "Darren," I said, my voice low, gravelly, and entirely calm. "What exactly is the meaning of this?" Darren finally looked at me, but his eyes were completely dead. The son I raised was gone. "It is over, Dad," he said coldly. "We own this house now. You need to pack up your trash and leave immediately." I raised a single eyebrow. "You own this house. I paid off this mortgage 20 years ago. The deed is in my name, and this house belongs to me." Chloe let out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed terribly in the room. "Not anymore," she sneered, stepping closer to me. "I still have my real estate contacts, Roland. It is truly amazing what a few forged signatures and a friendly, corrupt notary can do when an old man is supposedly losing his mind. We transferred the title of this property into a trust managed entirely by Darren and Maya. It is completely legal now. Well, legal enough to get you kicked out." I turned my attention to Trent. He was tapping his expensive leather shoe nervously against the floorboards. "Why the sudden rush to commit real estate fraud?" I asked him. Trent stepped forward, his arrogant smirk instantly fading into genuine sweat-inducing panic. "Because I need $500,000 by Friday morning," he snapped, his voice cracking with desperation. "I made some highly leveraged investments, crypto margins. The market tanked overnight, and the people I borrowed money from are not the kind of people who send polite collection letters in the mail. They are violent. They are threatening to break my legs, Roland. They know exactly where we live, and they know where my children sleep. We are selling this house tomorrow morning to a cash buyer that Chloe found. We are liquidating your house for $600,000. We take the cash, pay off my massive debt, and start fresh. You are just standing in the way of our survival. They were going to sell my beautiful home, my sanctuary filled with memories of my wife, for absolute pennies just to pay off a gambling debt to dangerous loan sharks." I slowly turned my head toward the dark hallway. Maya, my 42-year-old biological daughter, was standing in the shadows. She was wearing a luxurious silk robe she had purchased using my credit card years ago. Maya was incredibly vain, a severe shopaholic who cared more about her designer handbags than her own family. "Maya." I called out to her, my voice echoing in the quiet hall. "Are you really a part of this too?" Maya stepped into the light of the bedroom. She crossed her arms, her face a mask of absolute entitlement. She refused to show even a single ounce of guilt. "Dad, be reasonable for once in your life," she said, her voice dripping with extreme annoyance. "Trent is my husband. If he goes down to the mob, I go down with him. You are 74 years old. You do not need a 4-bedroom house all to yourself. You should have downsized years ago and given us our inheritance while you were still alive to see us enjoy it. You are being incredibly selfish hoarding this wealth." Selfish. The word bounced around inside my head. I had single-handedly funded Darren's 3 failed business ventures. I had paid off Maya's catastrophic shopping debts more times than I could even count. I had tolerated Chloe's blatant disrespect and Trent's absolute unearned arrogance. I had given them everything, and this was my ultimate reward: a forged real estate deed and a cheap plastic trash bag on a freezing, rainy November night. "Grab your coat," Darren commanded, taking a threatening step closer to me. "The cash buyer is coming at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning to do the final walkthrough. This house needs to be completely empty. We called a cab. It is waiting outside on the curb right now to take you to the downtown city shelter. Do not make this harder than it has to be, Dad. Do not make me get physical with you. My own biological son was threatening to put his hands on me to physically throw me out of my own home." In that exact moment, sitting on the edge of the mattress, I had shared with the love of my life. The father inside me completely died. The unconditional love, the endless patience, the deep desire to protect my children from the harsh realities of the world, it all evaporated into thin air. It was instantly replaced by a cold, calculating, and razor-sharp clarity. They thought they had backed a helpless, senile old black man into a corner. They thought I was a vulnerable, fragile victim who would break down, cry, and beg for their mercy. They thought they held all the power. They did not know the truth. They did not know that Beatrice and I had purchased a massive barren piece of land in the distant suburbs over 30 years ago. They did not know that a massive global technology corporation had just purchased that exact piece of land to build a gigantic data center. And they certainly did not know that $50 million in pure untaxed cash had been deposited directly into my secret, irrevocable trust account just last month. I had been waiting for Thanksgiving to tell them. I had been planning to divide the wealth and change all of our lives forever. But looking at their greedy, hateful faces, I realized the universe had given me a massive blessing in disguise. I stood up slowly. My knees popped, but my posture was perfectly straight. I towered over my son. I looked at the 4 of them in the room. Chloe with her greedy, calculating eyes. Trent with his pathetic, desperate panic. Darren with his weak, disgusting cowardice. Maya with her vain, superficial entitlement. They were no longer my family. They were parasites. I did not yell. I did not raise my voice. I did not even argue about the illegally forged deed. I simply bent down and picked up an old, worn brown envelope from my nightstand. Inside that envelope was the official banking certificate proving I was a multi-millionaire, along with the direct contact information for my high-profile wealth management attorney. I calmly slid the envelope into the inner pocket of my heavy wool winter coat. "Where do you think you are going with that?" Chloe demanded, pointing an accusatory finger at my pocket. Just some old photographs of Beatrice, I replied smoothly, my voice completely devoid of emotion. Nothing that holds any financial value for you. I stepped right over the trash bag of my spilled clothes. I did not take a single shirt. I did not need them. I walked past Darren, who actually flinched slightly as I approached his personal space. I walked past Trent, who desperately puffed out his chest, trying to look intimidating, but failing miserably. I walked past Maya, who cowardly looked down at the floor. I made my way down the wooden staircase that I had built and stained with my own 2 hands decades ago. The sound of the freezing rain lashing violently against the living room windows was deafening. I reached the front door and grabbed my sturdy black umbrella from the stand. Darren and Trent had followed me down to the foyer, standing a few feet away, just to make sure I actually left the premises. I opened the heavy front door. The freezing winter wind bit harshly into my face. The storm outside was incredibly violent, perfectly reflecting the absolute chaos they had just created in our lives. I turned back to look at my son and my son-in-law one last time. They looked so incredibly proud of themselves. They looked so completely convinced that they had won the game. You know, I said, my voice easily cutting through the loud sound of the pouring rain. You went through a whole lot of trouble just to steal a useless piece of paper. Darren frowned, his brow furrowing in confusion. What are you talking about? He snapped. Just leave already. I looked him dead in the eyes, stripping away every ounce of paternal warmth I had left. I'm telling you that you are making a grave mistake, Darren. This house will not save you. I stepped out onto the freezing porch and pulled the heavy oak door shut behind me. The lock clicked loudly. It was the distinct sound of my old life ending forever. I stood in the pouring rain for a brief moment. The cheap yellow cab they had called was waiting by the curb, the driver looking impatient with his headlights cutting through the darkness. I walked right past it. I pulled out my cell phone and opened my ride-sharing app. I did not order a regular car. I ordered a premium luxury black car service. I was not going to a filthy downtown shelter. I was going directly to the Waldorf Astoria Hotel to book their most expensive penthouse suite using my secret black card. They wanted to play a ruthless game of survival. They wanted to throw their own father to the wolves to save their own skin. But they forgot one very crucial detail about the man who raised them. I am the one who feeds the wolves. And starting tomorrow, they were going to find out exactly what happens when you try to steal from a man who secretly owns the entire board. The freezing rain pounded against the thick hood of my winter coat as I stood completely still on the dark sidewalk. I watched the cheap yellow cab speed away into the night after the driver finally lost his patience waiting for me to get inside. My own children had called that cab for me. They had ordered it to take me to a crowded downtown homeless shelter. They expected me to vanish into the most miserable corners of the city, sleeping on a stiff cot out of their sight and completely out of their way. They wanted to erase me from their lives so they could steal the home I built. But I did not get into that cab. Instead, a sleek, black, luxury premium vehicle pulled up to the curb exactly where I stood. The professional driver stepped out into the pouring rain holding a massive black umbrella and respectfully opened the rear door for me. I climbed into the back seat and let the heavy door shut behind me. The leather seating was incredibly warm. The air inside the cabin smelled like expensive cedar wood and quiet, undeniable wealth. I did not give the driver the address of a city shelter. I told him to take me directly to the Waldorf Astoria Hotel located in the absolute wealthiest district of Atlanta. As the heavy armored vehicle glided smoothly through the slick and dangerous streets, I watched the city lights blur through the rain-soaked windows. My mind was completely clear. There was no sadness left in my chest. There was no grief weighing down my shoulders. A father can only take so much blatant betrayal before his heart turns into solid, impenetrable ice. They thought they had outsmarted a foolish, senile old man. They thought I was completely dependent on their mercy, but they had absolutely no idea what was actually sitting inside the inner pocket of my wet coat. We arrived at the Waldorf Astoria in record time. The valet staff rushed out into the storm to open my door and guide me inside. I walked into the grand towering lobby. Massive crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceilings, casting a warm golden glow over the polished marble floors. It was a world entirely built for the elite, a place where people like my son Darren and my son-in-law Trent desperately pretended they belonged. I approached the front desk with slow, deliberate steps. The young clerk in a crisp, tailored suit looked at me with a polite but slightly confused expression. I was a 74-year-old black man, dripping wet from the winter storm, wearing a worn-out coat carrying absolutely no luggage. He probably assumed I had wandered in from the street to escape the freezing rain. "I need a room," I said, keeping my voice smooth and commanding. "The absolute best suite you have available right now." The clerk forced a highly trained professional smile. "Sir, our premium suites are quite expensive," he said, his tone dripping with a very subtle, practiced condescension. "We require a major credit card for the security deposit before we can even begin the booking process." I did not argue with him. I reached into my coat pocket. I did not pull out a standard plastic bank card. I pulled out a solid metal black card linked directly to my secret wealth management trust. I placed it flat on the marble counter. The heavy metal made a sharp, distinct clinking sound that echoed in the quiet lobby. "I want the penthouse," I said. "And I want complete and absolute privacy. No phone calls transferred to my room unless I explicitly clear them." The clerk looked down at the black card. His eyes widened slightly. The subtle condescension instantly evaporated from his face, completely replaced by urgent, absolute obedience. "Right away, Mr. Sinclair," he said, his fingers flying rapidly across his computer keyboard. "We will have the penthouse prepared for you immediately." 10 minutes later, I was standing right in the center of a massive, sprawling penthouse suite that overlooked the entire illuminated city of Atlanta. The floor-to-ceiling glass windows offered a perfect, unobstructed view of the skyline. The suite featured a private dining room, a sprawling marble bathroom, and a luxury bed large enough to sleep a small army. I took off my wet coat and draped it carefully over a plush velvet chair. I walked over to the cold glass and looked down at the tiny, distant cars moving along the highway far below. Somewhere out there in the dark suburbs, my son and my daughter were celebrating their grand, disgusting victory. They were probably popping cheap champagne in my living room, completely convinced they had finally secured their financial freedom by stealing an old man's house. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the worn brown envelope. I opened the flap and stared at the official banking certificate printed inside. $50 million, untaxed, pure liquid cash sitting safely in an offshore holding account. I let out a low, quiet laugh that held absolutely no humor at all. 30 years ago, my beautiful wife Beatrice and I bought a massive barren plot of land on the far outskirts of the city. Everyone told us we were completely crazy. My friends laughed at my face. They said a struggling black contractor had absolutely no business throwing his hard-earned money at useless dirt in the middle of nowhere. Bank managers denied our loans, looking at us like we were fools. But Beatrice had a brilliant vision. She told me the city would eventually grow outward. She told me that one day that exact patch of dirt would be worth its weight in solid gold. We held on to that land through brutal economic recessions. We held on to it when money was incredibly tight and we had to eat cheap beans and rice for a week straight. We sacrificed our own comfort to keep those property taxes paid every single year. Beatrice never lived long enough to see her brilliant prediction come true. She passed away 5 years ago, leaving a massive hole in my heart. But her vision was absolutely flawless. The city did grow. The urban sprawl expanded rapidly toward our property. And last month, one of the biggest technology corporations in the entire world decided they urgently needed our exact plot of land to build a massive global data center. They did not negotiate. They did not haggle over the price. They wanted the land immediately to beat their competitors, and they offered $50 million in pure cash to close the deal within 14 days. I finalized the complicated paperwork in complete secrecy. I placed the massive funds into an irrevocable trust under the name Beatrice Holdings. Nobody knew about it. Not my nosy neighbors, not my former coworkers, and especially not my greedy children. I walked over to the wet bar in the suite, poured myself a glass of sparkling water, and sat down on a plush leather sofa. I took out my cell phone and dialed the private emergency number for my wealth management attorney, Arthur Vance. He is a ruthless, highly efficient lawyer who handles extreme wealth for the top 1%. He is the kind of man who simply does not sleep when money is on the line. He answered the phone on the very second ring. "Good evening," Roland Vance said, his voice crisp and highly alert despite the late hour. "I honestly did not expect to hear from you tonight." "Is everything all right over there?" "Everything is perfectly fine, Arthur," I replied, taking a slow, deliberate sip of my water. "But we need to make some immediate and permanent changes to the financial distribution plan we discussed last week." I heard him typing rapidly on a mechanical keyboard in the background. "Go ahead and speak," he said. "I am pulling up your highly secure file right now." Originally, my entire plan had been a grand, loving gesture. I had invited Darren, Maya, Chloe, and Trent to a massive Thanksgiving dinner at my house at the end of the month. I had already ordered expensive, high-end catering. I was going to sit them all down at the dining table, look my children in the eyes, and hand them each a certified cashier's check for $5 million. I wanted to pay off all their embarrassing debts. I wanted to set up massive college funds for my grandchildren so they would never have to take out student loans. I wanted to watch my children cry tears of pure joy and tell them that their mother and I had finally secured their futures forever. I wanted to be the generous patriarch of a happy family. But that stupid, naive fantasy was completely dead. It died the exact second Chloe threw my folded clothes onto the floor in a cheap garbage bag. It died when Darren stood there with his hands in his pockets and watched his own father get violently evicted into the freezing winter rain. "Arthur," I said, keeping my voice entirely flat and completely devoid of emotion, "cancel the Thanksgiving distribution plan completely. Erase Darren and Maya from the trust beneficiaries list immediately. They are getting absolutely nothing. Not a single dime of this money will ever touch their hands." Arthur stopped typing. There was a very brief, heavy silence on the secure line. "Are you absolutely certain about this, Roland?" he asked carefully. "Removing biological children from a $50 million irrevocable trust is a massive legal decision. Did something severe happen tonight? They threw me out of my own house an hour ago," I told him, stating the facts simply. "They forged a real estate deed, illegally transferred my property into their own names, and told me to go live in a homeless shelter downtown. They did it because Trent owes $500,000 in leveraged crypto debts to some very dangerous, violent loan sharks. They think they are going to sell my house tomorrow morning to save his pathetic life." I heard Arthur let out a long, heavy sigh. "The sheer stupidity of greedy people never ceases to amaze me," Arthur said, his tone turning ice cold. "I am very sorry you had to experience that terrible betrayal, Roland. But from a strictly legal standpoint, your family has just made a catastrophic error." "I know they made a fatal error," I replied smoothly. "But I want to know exactly what they are doing right now. I want you to tap into Chloe's real estate licensing records immediately. She loudly claimed she had a cash buyer coming to do a final walkthrough at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. I need to know if she was bluffing." "Give me exactly 2 minutes," Arthur said. I heard the rapid, continuous clicking of his keyboard. Arthur had backdoor access to real estate databases and financial networks that most normal people did not even know existed. He was worth every single dollar of the massive retainer I paid him. While I waited patiently on the line, I looked down at the dark, rainy streets far below my window. My children thought I was wandering out there right now, shivering in the cold, completely lost and entirely broken. They probably thought I would eventually come crawling back to their doorstep tomorrow, begging to sleep on an old mattress in their damp basement. They had absolutely no concept of the terrifying power I now possessed. With $50 million sitting in my account, I could buy the apartment building they lived in and legally evict them onto the street. I could buy their outstanding debts and garnish their wages. I could completely and utterly ruin their entire lives without ever raising my voice or lifting a single finger. "Roland." "I have the data," Arthur said, suddenly interrupting my dark thoughts. His tone was suddenly very sharp, very serious. "You were completely right to call me. Chloe is moving incredibly fast. She is dangerously leveraging her own active real estate license to push this sale through illegal back channels. Explain the exact situation to me," I commanded. "She listed your property privately on an obscure off-market network 3 days ago," Arthur explained, reading from his screen. "She completely bypassed the standard legal verification protocols. She is using the forged deed they created to prove to the system that she has the right to sell the asset. And she actually found a buyer. It is a predatory, aggressive investment firm that buys distressed properties for immediate cash. How much money are they giving her for my home, I asked. They agreed to buy your house for $600,000 in pure wired cash, Arthur said. They are intentionally rushing the closing process to avoid standard inspections. They are scheduled to sign the final binding deposit contract tomorrow morning, right inside your living room. Chloe is desperately trying to secure the wired funds by Friday afternoon, so Trent can pay off his massive crypto debt before those loan sharks break his legs. The sheer unadulterated audacity of it was absolutely staggering. Chloe, a miserable failed agent who could barely sell a basic one-bedroom condo, was using her state license to commit massive coordinated real estate fraud against her own father-in-law. She genuinely thought she was a brilliant criminal mastermind. She actually thought she could casually liquidate my entire life's work in a matter of days and walk away totally clean and victorious. She is incredibly desperate, Arthur continued, his voice tight. The listing price she accepted is way below the actual market value of your neighborhood. She is throwing away hundreds of thousands of dollars of your equity just to get fast cash into her account. If we do not step in and stop this transaction tomorrow morning, the investment firm will legally transfer the funds, and unwinding that level of financial fraud will require a very lengthy and public court battle. We need to file an emergency legal injunction tonight. No, I said immediately, gripping my phone tightly. Do not file an injunction. Do not block the meeting from happening. Arthur paused, clearly confused by my sudden order. Roland, if they sign that physical contract and money changes hands, it gets very messy for everyone involved. Why on earth would we let them proceed with this meeting? Because I want them to firmly believe they have won the game, I said, a cold, ruthless smile slowly forming on my face. I want them to bring those wealthy cash buyers right into my home. I want them to sit down comfortably at my oak dining table. I want them to hold the expensive pen in their hands, completely ready to sign all their massive financial problems away forever. And right at that exact beautiful second of victory, I want to completely crush them into dust. I could practically hear Arthur smiling wickedly on the other end of the line. He understood exactly what I was building. I completely understand your vision, Roland. What is your direct instruction for tomorrow morning? I want you to meet me at my house tomorrow morning at exactly 8:15, I instructed him clearly. Bring the original legally binding trust documents that definitively prove my house was transferred into the Beatrice Holdings Irrevocable Trust last month. Bring the certified documents that prove any deed signed by my children after October is entirely fraudulent and highly illegal. We are not going to stop them in secret with a quiet phone call. We are going to walk right through my front door and humiliate them right in front of their wealthy cash buyers. Consider it done, Arthur said confidently. I will have all the certified watermarked copies printed, stamped, and ready in my briefcase. It will be a completely flawless legal execution. They will not see us coming until it is far too late. Thank you, Arthur, I said. I will see you tomorrow morning. Make sure you wear a nice suit. I ended the phone call and tossed my device onto the soft velvet cushions of the sofa. I walked back over to the expansive window and looked out at the glittering city one last time before going to sleep. The freezing rain was finally starting to slow down. The violent winter storm was passing over the state, but a much bigger, much more destructive storm was about to directly hit Darren, Maya, Chloe, and Trent. They threw me out like useless garbage because they firmly believed I was weak and defenseless. They thought I was just a tired old man who had outlived his usefulness to their selfish lives. Tomorrow morning, they were going to learn a very brutal, unforgettable lesson about real power, extreme patience, and devastating consequences. I turned off the warm lights in the penthouse, laid down on the massive king-size mattress, and for the first time in 5 long years, I slept perfectly and deeply. Tomorrow was going to be a very entertaining day. The morning sun cut through the cold November air as I sat perfectly still in the back of a heavily armored, bulletproof luxury sport utility vehicle. My driver parked the massive black car right across the street from my own house. The tinted windows were completely pitch black from the outside, meaning anyone walking past would just see their own reflection. But from the inside, I had a perfect, unobstructed view of the front porch I had built with my own hands 30 years ago. I was wearing a tailored charcoal suit, sipping a hot black coffee from a thermos and resting a high-definition tablet on my knees. They thought I was shivering in some damp alleyway downtown. They thought they had entirely removed me from the chessboard, but I was sitting 50 feet away, watching their every single move in crisp, high-definition color. 2 months ago, right around the time I finalized the $50 million land deal with the technology corporation. I had a professional security team install hidden cameras in every major room of my house. I did not install them because I suspected my children were criminals. I installed them because an old man living alone needs security. But today, those small invisible lenses were my absolute best weapons. I tapped the screen of my tablet. The camera feed switched from the driveway to the main living room. The microphone picked up the audio perfectly. My daughter-in-law Chloe was strutting around my living room like she owned the entire universe. She was wearing a sharp, expensive-looking white business suit that she probably bought using one of my secret credit cards. She was aggressively arranging decorative pillows on the sofa and wiping down the glass coffee table, trying to make the old house look like a premium real estate listing. My biological son Darren was sitting on my expensive leather armchair. He was nervously chewing on his fingernails, looking at his phone every 5 seconds. Trent, my white son-in-law, was pacing back and forth across the hardwood floor. He looked like a cornered rat. His face was pale and he was sweating heavily despite the cold weather outside. His massive crypto debt was clearly eating him alive. He needed that $500,000 by Friday, and today was Wednesday. Time was rapidly running out for him. Maya, my daughter, was standing near the fireplace, checking her makeup in the mirror, completely detached from the absolute theft they were committing. "Are you sure these buyers are bringing actual cash?" Trent asked, his voice shaking with intense anxiety. "We do not have time for banks to approve mortgage loans. If I do not wire the funds to those guys by Friday morning, they are going to send people to my house. They know where Maya sleeps. They know everything." Chloe rolled her eyes and let out a loud, theatrical sigh. "Stop panicking, Trent," she said in a highly condescending tone. "I am a licensed real estate professional. I know exactly what I am doing. These are corporate investors. They buy distressed properties, flip them, and rent them out. They do not use banks. They use massive wire transfers. I sent them the deed last night. They verified the signatures. As soon as they sign the deposit contract today, they will initiate a non-refundable wire transfer of $600,000. We will have the liquid cash in our joint account by tomorrow afternoon. You will pay off your stupid gambling debt, and Darren and I will take the rest to upgrade our lifestyle. It is a perfect, flawless plan." I watched my screen and took a slow sip of my coffee. It was truly fascinating to watch criminals discuss their crimes when they thought nobody was listening. Chloe genuinely believed her forged documents were a masterpiece. She had somehow managed to digitally copy my signature and get a corrupt notary public to stamp a fake transfer of deed. She thought she had completely bypassed the legal system. She was incredibly wrong. At exactly 8 o'clock in the morning, a silver luxury sedan pulled into my driveway. 2 men in sharp business suits stepped out. They were the corporate cash buyers. They looked like aggressive, no-nonsense investors who preyed on desperate sellers. I watched through the tinted window of my vehicle as Chloe practically ran out to the front porch to greet them. She put on her best fake customer service smile, shaking their hands vigorously and welcoming them into my home. I switched my tablet view back to the living room feed. The 2 investors walked inside, looking around the space with highly critical eyes. They did not care about the beautiful crown molding I had installed or the custom brick fireplace. They only saw profit margins and renovation costs. "The structure is solid," the older investor said, tapping the wall with his knuckles. "But the interior is incredibly dated. We will need to gut the entire kitchen and replace all these old hardwood floors. $600,000 is a very generous offer for this specific condition. We are taking a significant risk here. It is a beautiful property." Chloe lied smoothly, walking around the room with her arms wide open. "The old man who lived here simply let it go. But the bones are perfect, and as we discussed, we are highly motivated sellers. We are ready to sign the final contracts today and expedite the closing process immediately." Trent was practically vibrating with nervous energy. He stepped forward and aggressively shook the investor's hand. "Let us skip the tour and get straight to the paperwork," Trent said. "We are all busy men here. We want to close this deal right now." The investors exchanged a brief knowing look. They knew Trent was desperate, but they did not care. Desperation meant a fast, easy transaction for them. The older investor opened his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. He placed them directly onto my beautiful glass coffee table. Chloe handed Trent a fancy silver pen. Darren and Maya stood behind them, watching the paperwork like starving wolves looking at fresh meat. "This is the binding deposit agreement," the investor said smoothly. "Once you sign this, the property is officially under contract, and we will initiate the wire transfer to your provided account. The funds will clear within 24 hours. Trent grabbed the pen. His hand was visibly shaking as he lowered the silver tip toward the signature line. He was exactly 1 second away from believing he had saved his own life. He was 1 second away from thinking he had successfully stolen my home and escaped the violent loan sharks. I picked up my cell phone and sent a single one-word text message to my wealth management attorney, Arthur Vance. The message simply said, "Execute." Less than 5 seconds later, the heavy oak front door of my house swung wide open. It did not just open. It was pushed open with absolute authority. Arthur Vance stepped into the foyer. He was wearing an immaculate, tailored navy blue suit and carrying a rigid black leather briefcase. He walked with the terrifying confidence of a man who destroys lives for a living. Trent froze the silver pen hovering just an inch above the contract. Chloe spun around, her face instantly twisting into a mask of pure outrage. "Excuse me," Chloe shouted, marching toward the foyer. "Who do you think you are? We are in the middle of a private real estate transaction. You cannot just walk into our house." Arthur did not even blink. He completely ignored Chloe and walked straight into the center of the living room, standing directly between the cash buyers and my greedy children. He looked at Trent, then at Darren, and finally at Chloe, his eyes completely devoid of warmth. "My name is Arthur Vance," he said, his voice deep booming and commanding absolute attention. "I am the senior legal counsel for Mr. Roland Sinclair, and I am here to inform you that you are currently attempting to illegally sell a property that you do not own." Darren turned completely pale. Trent dropped the silver pen onto the glass table with a loud clatter. Maya physically took 2 steps backwards, suddenly looking like a terrified child. "That is an absolute lie," Chloe screamed, her voice reaching a hysterical, high-pitched frequency. "We have the deed. We have the notarized transfer of ownership. Darren and I are the legal owners of this property. Roland signed it over to us." Arthur let out a cold, sharp laugh. He placed his black leather briefcase onto the coffee table right on top of the buyer's contracts. He popped the golden latches and pulled out a stack of heavy watermarked legal documents secured in a premium binder. "You have a piece of paper featuring a highly amateur forged signature," Arthur stated loudly, making sure the cash buyers heard every single word. "What I have here is the official, certified, legally binding documentation from the state registry. This specific property was legally transferred into the Beatrice Holdings Irrevocable Trust exactly 45 days ago. Mr. Sinclair is the sole beneficiary and absolute controller of that trust. Therefore, any real estate deed dated after that transfer is completely fraudulent, entirely worthless, and highly illegal." The 2 corporate investors looked at each other, their faces hardening into masks of pure anger. They realized instantly that they were being dragged into a massive federal fraud case. "What is going on here?" the older investor demanded, glaring furiously at Chloe. "You explicitly told us the title was clean. You guaranteed there were no legal encumbrances. Are you trying to trap us in a fraudulent transaction?" "No, please listen to me," Chloe stammered, her fake professional confidence completely shattering into a million pieces. "This lawyer is lying. The old man is senile. He does not know what he is doing. We have the legal right to sell this asset." Arthur pulled another document from his folder and slammed it onto the table. "That is a certified letter from the State Attorney General's office," Arthur said, his voice echoing like thunder. "It clearly states that any attempt to finalize a sale on this property will immediately result in federal wire fraud charges, identity theft charges, and felony real estate fraud. If you sign that paper, gentlemen, you will be actively participating in a major criminal conspiracy." The older investor snatched his contracts right off the table, shoving them aggressively back into his briefcase. "We are absolutely done here," he barked at Trent and Chloe. "Do not ever contact our firm again. If you call us, we will report you to the authorities ourselves." The 2 men stormed out of the house, practically running to their silver sedan. I watched from the tablet as they drove away, leaving my children's greedy dreams completely pulverized in the dust. Inside the living room, there was a deafening silence. Trent stared at the empty space on the coffee table where his salvation had been resting just moments ago. Chloe was hyperventilating, her face flushed with embarrassment and rage. Darren was staring at Arthur as if the lawyer was the Grim Reaper himself. "You have exactly 60 seconds to vacate this property," Arthur told them, calmly checking his expensive gold watch. "Mr. Sinclair has gracefully decided not to press criminal charges for the forged deed today. However, if any of you are found on these premises after those 60 seconds, I will personally call the police and have you arrested for criminal trespassing. Have a highly unpleasant morning." Arthur snapped his briefcase shut, turned around and walked out of the house with absolute grace. He walked across the street, gave a very subtle nod toward my tinted window, and got into his own vehicle. I looked down at the tablet screen. The aftermath inside my house was absolutely beautiful to witness. Trent stood frozen for a few seconds before the reality of his situation completely crushed him. The cash buyers were gone. The money was gone. The violent loan sharks were coming for him by Friday morning, and he had absolutely nothing to give them. Trent suddenly let out a guttural, terrifying scream. He grabbed the heavy glass vase sitting on the coffee table and hurled it violently across the room. It smashed into 1,000 pieces against the brick fireplace. He grabbed a wooden dining chair and slammed it into the wall, splintering the wood and destroying the drywall. "This is impossible!" Trent roared, his face turning bright red, spit flying from his mouth. "That useless old man set us up. He knew exactly what we were doing. He let us bring the buyers here just to humiliate us. He completely destroyed my life. I am a dead man. I owe $500,000 and I have absolutely nothing." Darren rushed forward and grabbed Trent by the shoulders, trying to stop him from destroying the rest of my house. "Calm down, Trent," Darren yelled. "Trashing the place will not fix anything. We need to think. We need to figure out what to do next." Chloe was pacing around the room like a caged animal, running her hands through her hair. "He is not a senile fool," she muttered, her eyes wide with a dark, terrifying realization. "He has a high-powered lawyer. He has a trust fund. He set up an entire legal fortress behind our backs. We completely underestimated him." Maya stepped forward, her voice shaking with fear. "What do we do now?" she asked. "If he controls the trust, we cannot touch the house. We cannot get the money. Trent is going to be killed by the mob, and we are going to lose everything we have." Trent stopped struggling against Darren. He stood perfectly still, breathing heavily, his chest heaving up and down. A dark, sinister shadow crossed his face. The panic slowly morphed into something much more dangerous and purely evil. He looked at Chloe, then at Darren, and finally at Maya. His eyes were cold and dead. "If he holds the keys to the trust, then we need to take the keys away from him," Trent said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, deadly whisper. "What are you talking about?" Darren asked, taking a step back. "He just proved he is legally protected. We cannot forge another document. His lawyers will destroy us." "We do not need to forge a document," Trent replied, a sick, twisted smile forming on his lips. "We need to prove that the old man is completely out of his mind. We need to prove that he is a danger to himself and others. If he will not sign the house over to us willingly, we will prove he is insane. We will get a corrupt doctor to sign a medical certificate. We will establish a full legal conservatorship. Once the state declares him mentally incompetent, that fancy trust fund means absolutely nothing. I will become his legal guardian, and I will drain every single penny he owns." Chloe looked at Trent, her greedy eyes lighting up with fresh, malicious hope. "You are right," she whispered softly. "He is 74 years old. It is incredibly easy to convince the state that an elderly man has lost his mind. We can report him missing. We can say he is wandering the streets. We can hire a doctor who accepts cash under the table." Darren and Maya looked at each other, and instead of showing disgust at the horrible plan to destroy their own father's mind, they nodded in complete agreement. They were entirely willing to throw my sanity and my freedom into the garbage just to save themselves. I sat in the back of my bulletproof SUV staring at the tablet screen. My blood turned completely to ice, but my mind remained razor sharp. They wanted to play a dirty psychological game. They wanted to drag my name through the mud and lock me away in a mental asylum. I closed the tablet screen and looked up at the front of my house. They had absolutely no idea the level of warfare they had just initiated. I tapped the glass partition, separating me from my driver. "Take me back to the Waldorf Astoria," I commanded smoothly. "I have some very important medical appointments to schedule. Let us see who ends up in an asylum by the end of this week." The engine roared to life and the heavy black vehicle pulled away from the curb, leaving my treacherous family behind to plot their own absolute destruction. Desperate men make incredibly sloppy mistakes. They had absolutely no idea that from the very second they tried to steal my house, they had a permanent shadow. My attorney, Arthur Vance, had immediately deployed a top-tier private investigator to follow their every movement. The investigator was a former intelligence officer who blended in perfectly. He was watching through the lens of a high-definition long-range camera when Trent and Darren met a man named Dr. Elias Thorne in a dimly lit parking garage on the outskirts of the city. Dr. Thorne was a disgraced psychiatrist. He was the kind of man who had lost his credibility years ago and now survived by selling his medical signature to the highest bidder. My investigator captured the entire exchange in crystal-clear audio and video. I watched the live footage on my tablet from the comfort of my penthouse suite. Trent looked incredibly paranoid, constantly checking over his shoulder as he handed Dr. Thorne a thick, bulging manila envelope. Inside was $10,000 in pure cash, mostly from credit cards they had secretly maxed out in my name. In exchange for the stolen money, Dr. Thorne handed Trent an official stamped medical certificate. The document falsely claimed he had evaluated me and diagnosed me with aggressive late-stage Alzheimer's disease. It stated in bold letters that I was entirely incapable of managing my own finances, my property, or my physical well-being. It was the exact foundational document they needed to establish a full legal conservatorship. They wanted the state courts to officially declare me legally insane so Trent could become my absolute guardian. With that power, he could forcibly commit me to a locked psychiatric ward and siphon every single dollar from my estate. I watched the video feed as Trent opened the document, read the fake diagnosis, and let out a huge, relieved sigh. He actually smiled. He patted Darren on the back, completely convinced they had just secured the ultimate weapon against me. It was a sick, disgusting plan, but it was exactly what I wanted them to do. They were digging a massive hole, and I was going to let them jump into the bottom of it before I buried them alive. The very next morning, my children escalated their malicious campaign. They did not just want to file the paperwork quietly. They wanted to create a public spectacle to build a narrative of genuine concern. My investigator alerted me that Chloe, Trent, Darren, and Maya had all walked into the local police precinct and the main headquarters for Adult Protective Services. They were putting on the absolute performance of a lifetime. Through the audio surveillance device, my investigator had managed to slip near them. I listened as Chloe burst into loud, hysterical tears in front of a senior social worker. She cried out that her poor father-in-law had completely lost his mind and wandered into the freezing storm 2 nights ago. She claimed that I was deeply confused, hallucinating, and highly dangerous to myself. Darren played the role of the devastated, heartbroken son. He told the police officers that I had violently thrown my own clothes on the floor and ran away in a state of severe dementia-induced panic. They slammed Dr. Thorne's fraudulent medical certificate onto the desk, demanding that the authorities issue an immediate search warrant and an emergency mental health hold. They described me as a vulnerable, helpless, elderly man who could barely remember his own name. They pleaded with the social workers to find me before I got myself killed. The authorities took the bait completely. They initiated an active missing persons protocol. They alerted local hospitals and shelters to look out for a disoriented black man in his 70s matching my description. My children were actively using the police and protective services as hunting dogs to drag me back in chains so they could steal my wealth. When Arthur Vance called me to update me on the police activity, he sounded genuinely concerned. He advised me that fighting a state-sponsored emergency psychiatric hold could be very complicated if I was suddenly arrested on the street. He suggested we quietly contact the police chief and clear up the misunderstanding. I completely rejected his advice. I did not want to resolve this quietly. I wanted to turn their elaborate trap into an explosive career-ending humiliation. I told Arthur to assemble the absolute best medical minds money could buy. Within 3 hours, my penthouse at the Waldorf Astoria was converted into a private medical evaluation facility. Arthur brought in 3 of the most prestigious board-certified neurologists and geriatric psychiatrists in the entire state of Georgia. They were doctors who regularly testified as expert witnesses in massive federal court cases. Their medical opinions were considered absolute ironclad law. I sat comfortably in my plush chair while the three experts conducted a rigorous, exhaustive battery of cognitive and psychological tests. They tested my memory, my spatial reasoning, my logic, and my mental acuity. I answered every single question with razor-sharp precision. I recited complex financial figures, discussed current global economic events, and completed their puzzles flawlessly. After 2 hours, the lead neurologist, a highly respected woman from the university hospital, smiled and put down her clipboard. "Mr. Sinclair," she said, her voice filled with profound professional respect, "you possess the cognitive function of a man 30 years younger than you. You do not show a single microscopic sign of cognitive decline, let alone late-stage Alzheimer's disease. You are exceptionally lucid." I thanked her politely. I then asked all three doctors to sign and notarize a comprehensive joint medical affidavit, officially declaring my absolute mental competence. They gladly signed the documents, completely destroying the fake narrative my children had paid $10,000 to create. I now had the medical equivalent of an impenetrable titanium shield. It was finally time to make my grand appearance. I did not wear the simple, worn-out clothes my children were used to seeing me in. I put on a custom-tailored Italian wool suit, a silk tie, and a luxury gold watch that Beatrice had given me for our anniversary many years ago. I looked exactly like the multi-millionaire I secretly was. I ordered my private driver to take us directly to the main headquarters of Adult Protective Services. Arthur Vance rode in the back seat with me, carrying a thick leather briefcase loaded with my clean medical evaluations and the explosive surveillance footage. The three elite neurologists followed right behind us in a separate luxury vehicle. I was not just walking into the building to defend myself. I was marching in with an entire army of highly credentialed professionals to completely execute my enemies. When we arrived at the government building, I walked through the double glass doors with a steady, powerful stride. The lobby was bustling with social workers, police officers, and concerned families. And right there, sitting in the corner waiting area, were Trent, Chloe, Darren, and Maya. They were still pretending to cry, dabbing their eyes with tissues, putting on a sickening show of fake grief for a sympathetic social worker holding a clipboard. I stopped right in the middle of the room. I cleared my throat loudly. Darren looked up first. The fake tears instantly evaporated from his eyes. His jaw dropped open. Chloe gasped loudly, her hand flying to her mouth. Trent stood up so fast his chair tipped over backward and crashed loudly against the tiled floor. They stared at me as if they were looking at a ghost. I did not look like a lost, confused elderly man wandering the streets. I looked like a powerful corporate titan who had just walked off the cover of a financial magazine. Dad Darren stammered, his voice weak and trembling. "You are here. We were so worried about you." I completely ignored his pathetic lie. I looked directly at the senior social worker who was standing next to them with a shocked expression on her face. "Excuse me, madam," I said, projecting my voice so every single person in the lobby could hear me clearly. "My name is Roland Sinclair. I understand that these 4 individuals have filed a fraudulent police report claiming I am missing, completely senile, and a severe danger to myself." The social worker blinked in rapid confusion. She looked at my sharp suit, my clear eyes, and my confident posture. "Mr. Sinclair," she said hesitantly, "your family provided us with a signed medical document stating you suffer from advanced dementia. They said you wandered off in the freezing rain." I offered her a cold smile. "My family is currently attempting to commit severe medical fraud to establish a hostile conservatorship over my financial assets," I explained smoothly. Arthur Vance stepped forward and handed the social worker the thick stack of freshly signed affidavits. "These are official, legally binding evaluations completed exactly 1 hour ago by 3 of the top neurologists in this state," Arthur announced loudly. "These doctors are standing right behind me and are prepared to testify that Mr. Sinclair is exceptionally lucid and of sound mind. The document provided by his family is a complete fabrication purchased through a highly corrupt, disgraced physician." Trent turned incredibly pale. He started backing toward the exit doors like a frightened animal. "You cannot just come in here and make these insane accusations," Trent shouted, trying to sound offended but failing completely. "We have a legitimate medical certificate." Arthur pulled out a sleek electronic tablet from his briefcase. He turned the screen around and held it up for the social worker, the police officers in the lobby, and my terrified children to see. He hit the play button. The crystal-clear video played very loudly. It showed Trent in the dark parking garage, nervously handing the thick envelope of stolen cash to Dr. Thorne in exchange for the fake medical certificate. The audio of their criminal transaction echoed through the quiet lobby. Every single person heard Trent state he needed the fake diagnosis to lock the old man away and steal his bank accounts. The lobby of the Adult Protective Services building was completely paralyzed. Every single person in the room stared at the frozen, terrified faces of my children. The crystal-clear video playing on Arthur Vance's electronic tablet was the ultimate executioner's axe falling directly onto their necks. The senior social worker looked absolutely disgusted. She immediately picked up her heavy desk phone and loudly called for the facility security to detain them. But my children were absolute cowards. The very second they realized they were facing immediate federal charges for severe medical fraud, their base survival instincts kicked in. Trent violently shoved past a startled police officer sprinting toward the automatic sliding glass doors like a hunted animal. Darren aggressively grabbed Chloe by the arm, and the three of them dragged Maya out of the government building. They fled into the crowded city streets in absolute disgrace. I did not ask the police officers to chase them down. Running away was only going to delay their inevitable catastrophic destruction by a few short hours. Later that same afternoon, Arthur informed me that the Federal Bureau of Investigation had officially raided Dr. Elias Thorne. Federal agents kicked down the door to his shady medical clinic, confiscating every single hard drive, encrypted laptop, and filing cabinet. The corrupt doctor managed to slip out through a back alley and was currently a federal fugitive on the run. The entire conservatorship plan they had carefully built to steal my $50 million trust fund was completely pulverized into fine dust. They had no medical certificate. They had no legal standing. They had absolutely nothing left to save them from the impending storm. But the complete failure of their legal conspiracy was only the very beginning of their nightmare. The real terror was waiting for them right on their own front porches. My private investigator continued to monitor their every move, providing me with highly detailed, high-definition video updates of their rapid descent into pure financial chaos. Trent and Maya lived in a highly overpriced, heavily mortgaged, modern townhouse in a trendy, upscale neighborhood. They loved to show off their fake wealth to their wealthy neighbors, constantly pretending to be successful entrepreneurs. But that fake reality violently shattered on Thursday evening. The dangerous loan sharks Trent owed $500,000 to had finally lost their patience. They did not send a polite warning letter in the mail. They sent 3 massive, heavily armed enforcers directly to Trent's front door. My investigators' hidden cameras captured the entire brutal encounter from across the street. The enforcers kicked the front door open and dragged Trent right out of his beautiful living room by the collar of his expensive designer shirt. They threw him down onto his perfectly manicured front lawn. One of the massive men pulled out a heavy metal baseball bat and completely smashed the windshield of Trent's leased luxury sports car. Glass shattered everywhere, echoing loudly through the quiet, prestigious neighborhood. The wealthy neighbors peeked through their expensive window blinds, witnessing the absolute degrading humiliation of the man who always acted like he was better than everyone else. The lead enforcer grabbed Trent by the hair, pulled his bruised face inches away, and delivered a clear, unmistakable ultimatum. Trent had exactly 48 hours to produce $500,000 in pure liquid cash, or they were going to start breaking his bones one by one. They promised to come back for Maya next. Trent was left violently sobbing on the wet grass, clutching his bleeding face, completely paralyzed by a level of raw fear he had never experienced in his sheltered, highly privileged life. While Trent was facing the brutal, terrifying reality of the criminal underworld, my daughter-in-law Chloe was facing a completely different kind of public execution. Chloe defined her entire pathetic existence by her status as a luxury real estate agent. She loved to wear sharp business suits, sip expensive lattes, and pretend she was a major, untouchable player in the Atlanta housing market. She genuinely believed she was above the law. But Arthur Vance is a man who leaves absolutely no loose ends. He did not just stop Chloe from illegally selling my house. He gathered every single piece of undeniable evidence proving she had forged my signature, falsified a legal property deed, and attempted to completely bypass state real estate laws. Arthur compiled all of these damning documents into a thick, heavily certified legal portfolio and sent it directly to the managing broker of Chloe's prestigious real estate firm. He also sent a certified copy directly to the state licensing board. On Friday morning, Chloe walked into her glamorous downtown office, completely unaware that the ground beneath her feet had already collapsed into a massive sinkhole. My private investigator had a contact inside the corporate building who relayed the entire glorious event to me. The managing broker called Chloe into the main glass conference room right in the middle of a highly busy workday. He did not speak to her quietly. He threw the forged deed directly onto the long mahogany table and demanded an immediate on-the-record explanation. When Chloe tried to lie her way out of it using her typical arrogant passive-aggressive deflections, the broker fired her right on the spot. He loudly informed her that her real estate license was being permanently suspended pending a massive state investigation for felony wire fraud. He immediately ordered the building security team to physically escort her out of the premises. Chloe was forced to pack her desk belongings into a cheap cardboard box while all of her wealthy, highly judgmental colleagues watched her in total suffocating silence. The humiliation was absolute and entirely inescapable. She was escorted out the front glass doors, completely stripped of her career, her professional reputation, and her only source of legitimate income. They were bleeding out from every single artery. Darren and Chloe were financially ruined, facing the total, unmitigated collapse of their fake, lavish lifestyle. Trent and Maya were staring down the barrel of extreme physical violence from highly organized criminals. They were completely desperate, backed into a corner, and entirely out of options. They could not go to the police for protection because of their own extensive illegal activities. They could not go to any legitimate financial institution because their credit scores were entirely destroyed by their massive debts. They needed an absolute miracle to survive the week. They needed a guardian angel to swoop down and save them from the hell they had created. And I was going to give them exactly what they so desperately prayed for. I sat comfortably in my luxurious penthouse suite, slowly sipping a glass of aged bourbon, looking out at the beautiful city skyline. I called an emergency meeting with Arthur Vance and my senior financial advisors. I instructed my team to immediately activate a corporate shell company we had previously registered under the name Apex Horizon Financial Solutions. On paper, it looked like a highly aggressive, independent private equity firm that specialized in high-risk, high-reward emergency lending. In reality, every single dollar in that firm belonged directly to the Beatrice Holdings Irrevocable Trust. It was my money. I was the invisible heavy hand pulling every single string in this elaborate operation. I instructed my legal team to draft the most predatory, aggressive, ironclad loan agreements legally permissible in the state of Georgia. These were not standard banking loans. They were financial death traps designed to completely consume the borrower. The interest rates were astronomically high. The default penalties were immediate, severe, and entirely unforgiving. But the most important part of the trap was the required collateral. In order to receive the massive emergency cash payouts, Trent, Maya, Darren, and Chloe would have to sign away the total remaining equity of their homes and officially transfer the titles of their luxury vehicles directly to Apex Horizon Financial Solutions. If they missed even a single precisely timed payment, or if they violated any of the extremely strict behavioral clauses hidden deep within the dense legal fine print, my shell company would have the absolute legal right to immediately seize their properties and violently evict them onto the street without a lengthy court battle. I wanted to completely own the very roofs over their heads. I wanted to hold the physical keys to their basic survival right in the palm of my hand. Arthur Vance executed the plan with flawless precision. He used a third-party, highly discreet broker to directly contact Trent and Chloe. The broker presented himself as a savior for high-net-worth individuals facing temporary severe liquidity crises. He smoothly told them that Apex Horizon Financial Solutions was willing to fast-track a massive, no-questions-asked cash loan to solve all of their immediate problems. He offered Trent $600,000 to pay off his violent crypto debts and secure his physical safety from the mob. He offered Darren and Chloe $400,000 to keep their sinking lifestyle afloat while they dealt with their mounting legal issues. It was exactly the magical lifeline they were desperately begging for. They did not ask any critical questions. They did not hire an independent lawyer to read the dense, highly restrictive fine print. Desperate, terrified people do not care about the long-term financial consequences when a loaded gun is pointed directly at their heads. On Saturday morning, the four of them rushed into the sleek, modern downtown offices of Apex Horizon Financial Solutions. They were warmly greeted by professional smiling corporate executives who handed them freshly printed contracts and heavy expensive pens. My private investigator provided me with the live high-definition security feed from the conference room. I watched my children eagerly sign their names on the dotted lines without reading a single paragraph. I watched Trent's hand shaking with absolute pure relief as he signed away the legal rights to his expensive townhouse. I watched Chloe eagerly initial the pages that handed over the ownership rights to her luxury vehicles. They smiled at each other. They actually hugged each other, completely convinced that they had successfully outsmarted the universe once again. They thought they had found a magical financial loophole to escape the brutal consequences of their horrible actions. They thought this nameless, faceless corporate entity was their saving grace. They had absolutely no idea that every single signature was another heavy iron nail being hammered directly into their own coffins. They had no idea that the money being wired into their bank accounts was the exact same money they had tried to steal from me just a few days ago. The trap was officially sprung. The steel jaws slammed shut entirely around their ankles, and they were so incredibly foolish that they did not even feel the pain yet. I sat back in my comfortable leather chair staring at the frozen image of their smiling, ignorant faces on my tablet screen. They were now fully bound to me by chains made of solid, unbreakable legal iron. I owned their massive debts. I owned their beautiful homes. I owned their luxury cars. I owned their entire pathetic futures. I took a slow, highly satisfying sip of my bourbon. The intense financial bleeding had been temporarily stopped, but only because I was patiently preparing to personally harvest every single drop of blood they had left in their veins. The heavy wooden door leading down to the basement of my old house creaked loudly as Darren pushed it open. The air inside the narrow stairwell was thick. It smelled of damp earth and aged pine wood. Maya stood right behind her brother, holding a heavy yellow flashlight. They were trespassing in my home, the very home they had tried to steal from me just a few days prior. Even though they had just secured massive emergency loans from my secret financial company, their absolute greed was a bottomless pit. The money they borrowed only stopped the immediate bleeding. It did not satisfy their deep, toxic hunger for unearned wealth. They knew I had a secret trust fund. My lawyer, Arthur Vance, had explicitly told them about the Beatrice Holdings Irrevocable Trust. They could not sell the house, but they were absolutely convinced I had hidden emergency cash, gold bars, or valuable legal documents somewhere inside the property. They wanted leverage. They wanted a way to break into my trust. They walked down the wooden stairs, their footsteps echoing in the dark, empty space. I sat comfortably in my penthouse suite across the city, watching their entire pathetic burglary unfold on my secure tablet. I had deliberately placed a hidden night vision camera in the corner of the basement ceiling. I knew they would eventually come looking for my old iron safe. I had carefully planned for this exact moment. The basement was filled with old cardboard boxes, dusty wooden furniture, and the heavy metal tools I had used to build my contracting business decades ago. Darren walked straight toward the far back wall. Hidden behind a stack of thick moving blankets was my old heavy iron floor safe. It was a massive dark green steel box that weighed over 500 pounds. I had purchased it 30 years ago to store important business contracts and emergency cash. Darren pulled the heavy blankets away and shined his bright flashlight directly onto the thick combination dial. Maya crossed her arms and shivered in the cold basement air. She looked around the dirty room with absolute disgust on her face. "Do you really think he hid anything valuable down here in this filthy dungeon?" Maya asked, her voice echoing off the concrete walls. "He is a stubborn old man. He probably forgot the combination to this rusty box 10 years ago." Darren completely ignored her complaints. He dropped a heavy canvas duffel bag onto the concrete floor. The loud, clanking sound of solid metal tools echoed in the dark room. He did not come here to guess the combination. He came here to violently break into my private property. He unzipped the bag and pulled out a massive steel crowbar and a heavy sledgehammer. "He is hiding something in here," Darren said, his voice dripping with pure, toxic entitlement. "I know him. He never trusted banks. He always kept stacks of emergency cash and valuable gold coins hidden away. If that fancy lawyer of his was telling the truth about a trust fund, the original founding documents have to be locked inside this exact safe. We need to find the paperwork." We need to find the account numbers. We are going to crack this trust wide open and take what is rightfully ours." Darren raised the heavy sledgehammer high above his head and brought it down violently against the steel dial of the safe. The deafening sound of metal striking metal rang through the basement. He hit it again and again, grunting with intense physical exertion. Sweat began to pour down his face, soaking the collar of his expensive designer shirt. He dropped the sledgehammer and jammed the sharp end of the massive crowbar into the tiny gap between the heavy steel door and the thick frame. He leaned his entire body weight against the cold iron bar, pushing and pulling with desperate manic energy. Maya watched him struggle, her eyes wide with greedy anticipation. She aimed the bright beam of the flashlight directly at the cracking metal hinge. "Push harder, Darren," she urged him, her voice trembling with intense excitement. "We need to find the account numbers. I am not living on a strict budget for the rest of my life just because an old man decided to be selfish. Break the lock." Darren let out a loud, aggressive roar and threw his entire body weight against the heavy crowbar one final time. A loud, sharp cracking sound echoed through the basement. The thick steel locking mechanism inside the safe finally snapped and gave way. The heavy, dark green door swung open, hitting the concrete wall with a loud thud. Darren and Maya instantly dropped to their knees on the cold, dirty floor. They pushed each other out of the way, reaching their greedy hands into the dark interior of the heavy iron box. They were completely expecting to find massive stacks of $100 bills. They were expecting to find heavy gold bars or expensive jewelry. They were expecting a massive immediate financial payout to solve all their problems and fund their luxurious lifestyle. But there was no gold. There was no emergency cash. The massive iron safe was completely empty, except for a single pristine black leather folder resting quietly on the bottom metal shelf. Darren grabbed the leather folder. His hands were shaking with pure adrenaline and greedy anticipation. He placed the folder on his lap and slowly flipped open the heavy cover. Maya leaned in so close her shoulder was pressing aggressively against his. She pointed the bright yellow flashlight directly at the thick stack of premium watermarked legal paper resting inside. The very first document was an official, heavily stamped certificate from one of the largest and most prestigious private wealth banks in the entire world. Darren stared at the thick black ink printed across the center of the page. He stopped breathing. His eyes widened to an unnatural, terrifying size. He completely froze, paralyzed by the information his brain was attempting to process. Maya squinted her eyes, trying to read the legal text over his shaking shoulder. "What is it?" she asked, her voice tight with extreme impatience. "Is it the trust fund account? How much money is in there? Tell me right now." Darren did not speak. He could not speak. His vocal cords were completely paralyzed by absolute, unadulterated shock. He slowly lifted a trembling finger and pointed at the final balance printed boldly at the bottom of the official banking certificate. Maya followed his pointing finger. She stared at the number. She blinked once. She blinked twice. Then all the color completely drained from her face. Her jaw dropped open in pure, horrifying disbelief. $50 million. The number was printed clearly and undeniably in bold black ink. $50 million in pure, untaxed liquid cash. It was not tied up in complicated real estate equity. It was not locked away in untouchable stock options. It was cold, hard, immediate cash sitting safely inside a private offshore account under my absolute and exclusive control. Darren flipped to the next page with violently shaking hands. It was a drafted, unsigned copy of my last will and testament. I had carefully placed it in the safe just a few days before they kicked me out of my house. I wanted them to find it. I wanted them to read every single word. Darren read the highlighted legal paragraphs aloud, his voice cracking and breaking with every single syllable. The document clearly stated that upon the Thanksgiving holiday, the sum of $20 million was to be divided equally between my biological son Darren and my biological daughter Maya. It stated that their massive debts would be paid in full. It stated that comprehensive college funds would be established for all of my grandchildren. It was a massive, life-changing financial inheritance freely given out of pure, unconditional parental love. But right below those generous provisions was a newly added, heavily initialed legal clause. It stated that if any beneficiary attempted to claim the property before my natural death or attempted to harm me in any way, they would be immediately and permanently removed from the trust entirely. The heavy leather folder slipped from Darren's shaking hands and hit the concrete floor with a soft thud. He collapsed backward against the dusty basement wall. He grabbed his own hair, pulling at the roots, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Maya dropped the heavy yellow flashlight. It rolled across the floor, casting long, distorted shadows against the walls. She brought both of her hands to her mouth, letting out a loud, terrifying wail of absolute despair. The horrific realization crashed down upon them like a collapsing building. They had not just evicted a poor, helpless old man to save themselves from a minor financial crisis. They had violently thrown away a guaranteed $20 million inheritance. They had forcefully kicked a 50-millionaire out into the freezing rain. They had completely ruined their entire lives over a desperate, pathetic attempt to steal an old cheap house. I sat in my luxurious penthouse, watching their psychological destruction unfold in perfect high-definition video. It was a beautiful, deeply satisfying masterpiece. I watched Maya curl into a tight ball on the dirty concrete floor, sobbing uncontrollably, her tears ruining her expensive makeup. I watched Darren stare blankly at the dark ceiling, his chest heaving as he realized he had literally thrown away extreme generational wealth because he was too impatient and too greedy to wait a few more weeks. They sat in the cold, dusty basement for a very long time, completely crushed by the massive weight of their own catastrophic stupidity. The silence in the room was only broken by Maya's pathetic, continuous sobbing. But then something shifted. I watched closely as Darren slowly lowered his hands from his face. The deep, crushing despair in his eyes began to vanish. It was not replaced by guilt. It was not replaced by genuine remorse for how horribly he had treated the father who raised him. It was replaced by something entirely different. It was replaced by a dark, sinister, and completely malicious greed. Darren picked up the heavy leather folder from the floor. He stared at the $50 million banking certificate. His breathing slowed down. His jaw clenched tightly. He turned to look at his sister, who was still crying pathetically on the ground. "Stop crying, Maya." Darren ordered, his voice suddenly cold and dangerously calm. "Stop crying right now." Maya looked up at him, her eyes red and puffy. "How can you say that?" She sobbed loudly. "We lost everything. We threw him out. He is never going to give us a single dime of that money now. We ruined our entire lives." "We did not ruin anything," Darren said, gripping the leather folder so tightly his knuckles turned completely white. "We just did not know the stakes of the game we were playing. We were fighting over pennies when the old man was hiding a massive fortune behind our backs." Darren stood up. He walked over to the heavy iron sledgehammer resting on the floor and picked it up. He gripped the wooden handle with intense purpose. "He is 74 years old, Maya." Darren said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, deadly whisper. "He is an old, frail man. He cannot protect $50 million all by himself. He cannot hide from us forever. We know he has the money now. We know it exists in pure liquid cash." Maya slowly stopped crying. She wiped the dark makeup from her cheeks and looked up at her brother. The same dark, twisted greed began to take root in her own eyes. The sheer magnitude of $50 million completely blinded them to any remaining sense of human decency or familial love. They did not feel sorry for breaking my heart. They only felt angry that they did not get their hands on my money first. "What are we going to do?" Maya asked, her voice trembling with a new dangerous energy. "His lawyer is protecting him. The trust is completely locked down. We cannot forge another document. They will send us to federal prison." "We are not going to forge anything," Darren replied smoothly, a sick and twisted smile forming on his face. "We are going to make him sign it over to us willingly." "He will never do that," Maya argued, standing up and brushing the dust off her expensive clothes. "He hates us. He knows we tried to steal the house. He will never sign a single paper giving us that money." Darren let out a low, dark laugh. He tossed the heavy sledgehammer onto an old wooden workbench. "He will sign it if we give him absolutely no other choice," Darren said, his eyes burning with intense malice. "We just need to find exactly where he is hiding. We need to catch him completely alone without his expensive lawyers and his private security. We will bring Trent. We will corner the old man, and we will forcefully explain to him that he is going to sign a full, irrevocable power of attorney, granting us total control over his finances." Maya swallowed hard, stepping closer to her brother. "And what if he refuses to sign it? What if he fights back?" Darren looked directly into the hidden camera on the ceiling. It was purely a coincidence, but it felt as if he was staring straight into my soul. If he refuses to sign it, Darren said coldly, we will simply have to break his fingers until he changes his mind. He is going to give us that $50 million, Maya, even if we have to beat the signature out of him. I sat back in my plush velvet chair in the penthouse. My blood turned to absolute ice, but my heart remained entirely calm. I had given them every single opportunity to walk away. I had given them the chance to realize their mistakes and feel genuine remorse. But $50 million had completely stripped away their human masks. They were no longer my children. They were violent predators actively plotting to physically assault a senior citizen to steal his wealth. I picked up my cell phone and dialed Arthur Vance. I did not need to explain the situation to him. I knew he was monitoring the basement audio feed as well. Arthur, I said softly into the receiver, did you hear their new strategy? I heard every single word Roland Arthur replied, his voice tight with professional anger. They have crossed the line from financial fraud into conspiracy to commit violent assault. I am upgrading your private security detail to a Tier 1 status immediately. I will bring in former military operators. They will not get within 50 feet of you. No, Arthur, I instructed him clearly. Tell the security team to stay completely out of sight. I want Darren and Trent to find me. I want them to think they have cornered me. I want them to make their move. Arthur paused. That is incredibly dangerous, Roland. They are highly desperate and fully prepared to use physical violence. Let them try, I said, a cold, ruthless smile spreading across my face. They want to play a violent game. They want to use force. We are going to let them step right into the trap. And when they do, we are going to completely and utterly destroy them. I hung up the phone. The true war was no longer about real estate or fake medical documents. It was about pure, unfiltered survival, and I was more than ready to show my children exactly why you never hunt a man who owns the entire forest. My 2 children stood in my bedroom pointing toward the front door. Get out of this house right now, they shouted. They stood there completely cold and heartless. I looked at the black trash bag containing my clothes scattered on the hardwood floor. I did not scream. I did not beg. I simply picked up a worn brown envelope from my nightstand, walked out into the freezing rain, and took $50 million with me. 2 weeks later, they were on their knees begging for their lives. I am Roland Sinclair. I am 74 years old, and until recently, I believed that family was the one thing in this world you could truly rely on. For decades, I broke my back as a general contractor here in Atlanta, building a life from the ground up, so my family would never have to know the struggles I endured. My late wife Beatrice and I gave our children everything we never had. We poured every ounce of our souls into their futures. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family that completely underestimated your worth. I wanted them to find me. You cannot effectively trap a desperate rat unless you leave a highly visible piece of cheese right out in the open. I instructed my wealth management attorney, Arthur Vance, to strategically leak my physical location. We used a low-level bank teller who we knew was highly susceptible to simple bribes. Trent and Darren had been desperately calling every single financial institution in the corporate district, frantically trying to locate the holding accounts for Beatrice Holdings. We let the corrupt teller accept a few $100s to quietly slip them the address of a private wealth management office located in the downtown commercial sector. I scheduled a completely fake meeting there for late Thursday evening. I knew they were running out of time. Trent had a violent debt due by Friday morning, and the crushing weight of his impending doom was making him incredibly reckless. The commercial district is completely dead after 8 o'clock at night. The towering glass office buildings empty out entirely, and the massive concrete parking structures become dark, echoing caverns of shadows and silence. I told my personal driver to drop me off on the 4th level of the parking garage and to go get a cup of coffee down the street. I wanted to appear entirely alone. I wanted them to see a 74-year-old man walking by himself through a dimly lit, empty concrete structure. I was wearing a heavy wool overcoat and carrying a simple leather briefcase. I walked slowly across the cold pavement. I intentionally dragged my left foot just a fraction of an inch to make myself look weak, fragile, and completely exhausted. I was playing the exact role they expected me to play. I was the vulnerable, helpless prey. The loud aggressive screech of heavy rubber tires echoing through the concrete garage shattered the quiet night. A dark gray sports utility vehicle sped around the sharp corner, completely ignoring the painted lane markers, and slammed on its brakes right in front of me. The vehicle parked at a sharp, violent angle, entirely blocking my path to the elevator banks. The bright halogen headlights blinded me for a brief second, casting long, distorted shadows against the gray concrete walls. The heavy doors of the vehicle flew open before the engine was even completely turned off. Darren and Trent stepped out into the harsh fluorescent light of the parking garage. They looked absolutely terrible. The intense stress of their massive financial debts and the sheer panic of their impending destruction had completely destroyed their carefully crafted appearances. Darren was wearing a wrinkled, dark hoodie, his eyes bloodshot and wide with manic, unhinged desperation. Trent looked even worse. The expensive designer clothes he usually wore to project his fake wealth were replaced by a dirty, oversized jacket. He was sweating profusely despite the cold winter air. He was shifting his weight rapidly from foot to foot, clutching a thick stack of printed legal documents and a heavy black pen in his shaking hands. They marched toward me with aggressive, highly purposeful strides. They did not look like concerned family members. They looked exactly like the violent, desperate predators they had truly become. Darren positioned himself slightly to my left, attempting to block any potential escape route toward the stairwell. Trent stepped right into my personal space, completely invading my physical boundaries. He aggressively slammed the thick stack of papers against my chest, forcing me to put my hands up to stop the documents from falling to the concrete floor. "Sign the papers right now," Trent demanded, his voice shaking with a toxic mixture of pure adrenaline and absolute terror. "Sign the full power of attorney and transfer the trust control directly to us. Do not say a single word to me. Do not try to negotiate your way out of this. You are going to sign these papers right here, or we are going to force you into the back of that vehicle and make you sign them somewhere much worse." I did not flinch. I did not step back. I simply looked down at the crumpled legal papers pressed against my winter coat and let them fall from my grasp. The documents scattered across the dirty concrete, blowing slightly in the cold wind moving through the open garage structure. Darren grabbed me aggressively by the collar of my heavy wool coat. His hands were shaking violently against my neck. "Do not play games with us today, old man," Darren shouted, spittle flying from his mouth and hitting my cheek. "We know all about the $50 million. We broke into the basement safe. We saw the bank certificate. You hid that massive fortune from us for months. You watched us struggle financially, and you kept it all to yourself. You owe us that money. You are going to give us the control codes right now." I looked my biological son dead in the eyes. "I do not owe you a single breath of air, Darren," I said smoothly, my voice echoing coldly and calmly in the empty garage. "You did not struggle. You simply threw away every single opportunity I ever handed to you. I funded your failed business ventures. I paid off your ridiculous debts. You are a 45-year-old child throwing a violent temper tantrum because you finally realize the bank of your father is permanently closed." Trent stepped forward and aggressively shoved Darren aside. He grabbed my coat with both of his hands and pushed me roughly against a thick concrete pillar. The rough stone scraped against my back, but I maintained my perfectly calm, unbothered expression. Trent was completely unhinged. The fake mask of the sophisticated progressive technology visionary was entirely gone. His true nature, the ugly, ignorant reality he had kept hidden behind fake smiles and passive-aggressive comments for years, finally boiled over into outright unfiltered rage. "You listen to me very closely," Trent hissed, his face turning bright red, the thick veins in his neck bulging against his pale skin. "You are nothing but a lucky old black man who stumbled onto a piece of dirt 30 years ago. You do not even deserve that kind of money. You do not have the education to manage it. You do not have the proper pedigree to hold it. That wealth belongs in the hands of people who actually know how to build empires. People like me. You are going to sign the trust over to me right now, or I swear to God I will drag you into that trunk and break every single bone in your fragile hands until you cannot even hold a pen." I stared deeply into Trent's panicked eyes. I did not feel angry. I felt an overwhelming sense of absolute pity for the pathetic, desperate creature standing in front of me. "You owe $500,000 to violent criminals because you are a complete and total failure, Trent. I said softly, driving the words directly into his deepest insecurities. You have no empire. You have no pedigree. You are just a mediocre, incredibly arrogant man who is about to lose everything he has ever touched. And you are right about one specific thing. I am a black man who built a massive fortune from the dirt, and I am exactly the man who is going to completely destroy your miserable life. Trent let out a guttural roar of pure, uncontrollable fury. He grabbed my arm and violently yanked me forward away from the concrete pillar. Darren rushed in to help him complete the assault. They grabbed my shoulders together, aggressively pulling me toward the open back door of their dark vehicle. They were entirely committed to committing a violent federal felony. They were physically kidnapping an elderly man in a dark parking garage just to extort his wealth. They pulled me 3 heavy steps toward the car, panting and cursing, completely convinced they had finally overpowered me and won the game. They never even saw the shadows move. My personal security detail had been completely invisible, silently tracking my exact position from the upper and lower levels of the concrete garage. They were former Navy SEALs, highly trained tactical operators who specialized in extreme close-quarters combat and immediate threat neutralization. They moved with terrifying, blinding speed and absolute lethal silence. It took exactly 10 seconds to completely end the confrontation. A massive figure dressed in tactical dark gear stepped out from behind a concrete pillar directly behind Trent. The operator grabbed Trent by the back of his neck and the belt of his trousers simultaneously. With a single, fluid, incredibly violent motion, the security expert swept Trent completely off his feet and slammed him face first into the hard concrete floor. The sickening sound of Trent's jaw hitting the asphalt echoed loudly through the garage. Before Darren could even turn his head to process what was happening, a second operator materialized from the darkness on my left side. He grabbed Darren's outstretched arm, twisted it sharply and painfully behind his back, and drove his heavy knee directly into Darren's spine. Darren was pinned violently to the ground in a fraction of a second. Trent let out a high-pitched, agonizing scream as the first operator pressed a heavy tactical boot firmly against the back of his head, completely immobilizing him against the dirty floor. Darren was sobbing loudly into the concrete, his arm twisted at a highly unnatural angle, completely unable to move a single muscle without experiencing blinding pain. The heavy dark parking garage was suddenly entirely under the physical control of my private security force. 2 more armed operators stepped out of the shadows, securing the perimeter and completely blocking the vehicle exit routes. I stood perfectly still in the center of the chaos. I took a moment to slowly smooth the wrinkles out of my heavy wool coat. I adjusted my cuffs and looked down at the 2 pathetic men pinned helplessly against the cold asphalt. Trent was bleeding slightly from his split lip, his eyes wide with absolute, unadulterated terror as he stared at the tactical boots holding him down. Darren was whimpering like a beaten dog, his face pressed directly against the spilled, useless legal documents they had tried to force me to sign. I walked slowly toward them. The heavy, deliberate thud of my leather shoes echoed in the quiet garage. I stopped right next to Trent's head. I looked down at him with a cold, ruthless smile slowly spreading across my face. He tried to speak to beg for mercy, but the operator applied just enough pressure to keep his mouth shut against the floor. "Thank you," I said, my voice smooth and perfectly calm, completely ignoring their pathetic whimpering. "I needed concrete, irrefutable evidence of a violent felony to permanently seal your fate with the authorities. Thank you for providing the high-definition security footage for an attempted kidnapping." I stepped gracefully over their pinned, trembling bodies. I did not look back as my personal driver pulled my bulletproof luxury vehicle around the corner, completely ignoring the dark sports utility vehicle blocking the lane. My driver stepped out into the cold night and respectfully opened the heavy rear door for me. I climbed into the warm, comfortable leather seat. The security operators remained behind to hold the violent criminals against the concrete until the heavily armed police units arrived to arrest them. I instructed my driver to take me back to my penthouse. The night had unfolded exactly as perfectly as I had meticulously planned. Trent and Darren were sitting in a cold concrete holding cell downtown. They had been officially charged with attempted kidnapping and severe assault. Their incredibly quick path to a $50 million fortune was permanently blocked by thick iron bars and federal charges. But out in the affluent suburbs, my daughter-in-law Chloe was watching her entire fake reality crumble into dust. Her husband was facing federal prison. Her luxury real estate career was completely destroyed by her own forged documents. The massive predatory loan she took from my secret shell company was ticking like a destructive time bomb inside her bank account. She was backed into a tight corner with absolutely nowhere left to run. So she decided to do what highly privileged, deeply manipulative people always do when they are finally held accountable for their horrific actions. She decided to play the ultimate victim for the entire world to see. Chloe did not go to the police department to confess. She knew the detectives already had all the video evidence they needed to lock her family away for a very long time. She went straight to the internet. She set up a bright ring light in the middle of her messy living room to create the perfect lighting. She intentionally smudged her expensive makeup to look like she had been crying alone in the dark for days. She messed up her perfectly styled blonde hair to appear completely unhinged by stress. She put on an oversized, faded wool sweater to look small, fragile, and entirely defenseless to anyone watching. She hit the record button on her cell phone and unleashed the most powerful, destructive weapon she possessed in her entire arsenal. The undeniable weapon of white woman tears. I sat in my quiet penthouse suite, watching the video play on my high-definition tablet. Chloe stared directly into the camera lens with wide, terrified eyes. She took a deep, shaky breath and let a single, perfectly timed tear roll down her pale cheek. She introduced herself as a desperate, heartbroken mother fighting for the basic survival of her innocent children. Then she pointed her malicious finger directly at me. She told her millions of new followers that her wealthy, abusive, toxic father-in-law was deliberately trying to destroy her family out of pure spite. She looked right into the lens and lied to the public with the terrifying ease of a professional psychopath. Chloe told the internet that I was secretly hoarding a $50 million fortune while I intentionally forced my young grandchildren to starve. She completely fabricated a sickening narrative where I was a cruel, domineering patriarch who used money to emotionally abuse and violently control everyone around me. She claimed that Trent and Darren only tried to talk to me in the parking garage to beg for grocery money, and that my violent, heavily armed security team brutally assaulted them for absolutely no reason. She cried hysterically on the video, begging the public for immediate financial help, claiming that the corrupt legal system was protecting a rich monster while a poor innocent mother was being violently targeted and silenced. The video exploded across every single social media platform like a massive digital wildfire. Within 24 hours, it had accumulated over 10 million views. The social media algorithm aggressively pushed her fake, sobbing face onto the screens of millions of strangers who knew absolutely nothing about the actual truth. The internet mob is a terrifying, mindless beast that acts entirely on raw, unverified emotion. They did not ask for official police reports. They did not ask for security footage. They saw a crying woman and immediately picked up their digital pitchforks to hunt me down. My name began trending across the country for all the wrong reasons. Thousands of hateful, deeply racist, and incredibly vile comments flooded the internet forums. Strangers from all over the world were calling me a monster, a domestic abuser, and a selfish tyrant who deserved to die alone. They demanded that the local authorities arrest me immediately. They started digital petitions to freeze my personal bank accounts and distribute my entire wealth to my supposedly starving family members. News outlets began picking up the viral story, running highly sensationalized headlines about the wealthy grandfather starving his own blood. Chloe had successfully weaponized the blind sympathy of the entire world and directed it like a loaded gun straight at my head. Seeing the massive wave of public support and potential financial gain, my biological children eagerly joined the disgusting circus. Maya posted her own emotional video from her luxurious living room. She deliberately wore zero jewelry and cried into the camera, claiming I had been an emotionally distant and cruel father her entire life. She falsely stated that I had cut her children off from their medical insurance out of pure spite. Darren, having just posted a massive cash bail, filmed a video standing right outside the county jail. He played the role of the oppressed, traumatized son perfectly. He looked directly into the camera and said he was only trying to protect his frightened wife and hungry children from my tyrannical wrath when my security team viciously attacked him in the dark. They were building a massive, towering echo chamber of absolute lies. They set up online fundraising accounts, begging the public for immediate cash donations to help them fight the evil billionaire grandfather in court. Gullible strangers were actually sending them hundreds of thousands of dollars. They were doing interviews on popular internet podcasts, spinning wild, elaborate stories about my supposed decades of horrific abuse. They felt entirely untouchable. They thought public opinion would force me to surrender my wealth. They truly believed that if they screamed loud enough and cried hard enough, the actual truth would simply be buried under the heavy weight of their manufactured outrage. My wealth management attorney, Arthur Vance, did not share my calm, patient demeanor. He barged into my hotel suite early Friday morning with an entire team of aggressive corporate litigators trailing right behind him. Arthur looked absolutely furious. His expensive, tailored suit was slightly wrinkled, and he was gripping a thick stack of printed social media transcripts in his shaking hands. He slammed the heavy documents down onto my glass dining table. The loud smack echoed sharply in the quiet penthouse. "Roland, this situation has gone completely out of control," Arthur stated, his voice tight with intense professional rage. "They are assassinating your character on a massive global scale. Chloe is doing national morning television interviews tomorrow. The public fundraising accounts they set up have already collected over $200,000. They are actively monetizing defamation and committing massive public fraud. We have the parking garage security footage. We have the audio recordings of them planning to drug you. We have the financial documents proving they stole from you. I have a team of 10 lawyers ready to file a $50 million defamation lawsuit right this very second. We can secure an emergency judicial gag order by noon and shut their entire operation down immediately." The room full of aggressive attorneys nodded in intense agreement, waiting eagerly for my command to launch their legal missiles. They were practically foaming at the mouth, ready to completely annihilate Chloe and my children in civil court. I stood silently by the large glass window, looking down at the busy city streets far below. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my hot black coffee. The dark liquid was bitter and strong, matching the exact feeling resting deep in my chest. I turned around slowly and looked at the angry legal professionals crowding my living space. I slowly raised my right hand. The simple, quiet gesture instantly silenced the entire room. Arthur stopped talking. The aggressive lawyers froze in place. "Do not file a single lawsuit today," I commanded, my voice incredibly low, smooth, and completely devoid of any panic. "Do not contact any social media platforms to remove their videos. Do not release any of our security footage to the press. Do not issue a single public statement defending my character. We are going to do absolutely nothing." Arthur stared at me as if I had completely lost my mind. "Roland," he said, stepping much closer to me, "they are actively destroying your reputation. They are using this fake victim narrative to paint you as a literal monster. If we do not fight back immediately, the public will completely believe their lies. You cannot just sit here in this room and let them ruin your good name while they steal money from innocent people." I walked over to the glass table and looked down at the printed screenshots of Chloe crying her fake tears. I felt absolutely nothing for her. I felt nothing for Darren or Maya. They were actively dancing on a grand stage built entirely out of rotten wood. "Arthur," I said softly, looking him dead in the eyes, "you are looking at this situation like a traditional lawyer. You are only looking at the immediate damage control. I am looking at the entire war. If we stop them right now, they will just claim we used our massive wealth to aggressively silence them. The public will see an immediate gag order as definitive proof of their ridiculous narrative. They will become permanent martyrs. I absolutely refuse to let them become martyrs." I pointed a firm finger at the printed image of Chloe's crying face. "They are currently building a massive tower of lies," I explained to the silent room. "They are climbing higher and higher every single day, fueled by internet validation and stolen donation money. They feel incredibly powerful right now. They feel completely invincible. Let them climb, Arthur. Let them stand at the very peak of their lies. Let them gather the attention of the entire world. Let every single news station point their bright cameras directly at their faces." The lawyers in the room exchanged confused, nervous glances, but Arthur remained perfectly still, slowly beginning to understand the dark, calculating depth of my overall strategy. I took another slow sip of my coffee, letting the silence hang heavily in the air. "When you push someone off a simple stepping stool, they might sprain an ankle," I continued, my voice echoing coldly in the bright room. "They can easily recover, brush themselves off, and walk away with a minor injury. But when you let them climb to the absolute top of a massive skyscraper, when you let them build their platform so incredibly high that everyone in the entire world can see them clearly, the sudden drop is completely fatal. The fall from the top will break all their bones. We have the high-definition security footage I reminded him, tapping the glass table. We have the crystal-clear audio of Trent bribing a corrupt doctor. We have the official bank statements proving Chloe forged a real estate deed. We hold every single piece of undeniable empirical truth in our hands. The internet mob does not matter right now. Public opinion is entirely fickle and easily manipulated by fake tears. But facts are absolute. And when we finally drop the truth, I want the impact to be so massive, so incredibly destructive, that their reputations are completely pulverized into a fine powder that can never be put back together again. Arthur slowly nodded his head. The professional rage in his eyes was instantly replaced by a deep, dark respect for the long game. He understood the assignment perfectly. He turned around and instructed his legal team to stand down entirely and pack up their thick documents. "We are going to wait," I told them as they headed toward the heavy wooden door. "We are going to let them steal their donation money. We are going to let them lie on national television. We are going to give them enough heavy rope to completely hang themselves. And when the time is perfectly right, we are going to kick the wooden chair right out from underneath them." The legal team left the penthouse suite, leaving me completely alone with my quiet thoughts. I walked back to the massive glass window and looked out at the sprawling, bustling city. My phone buzzed loudly on the marble counter with another news alert about Chloe's viral video reaching new audiences. I did not even bother to pick it up and read it. The trap was already perfectly set. The predator was simply waiting patiently in the dark shadows. They thought they were singing a beautiful, triumphant song of victory, but they had absolutely no idea it was actually their own funeral march. The world outside my penthouse window was loud and chaotic. Millions of people were screaming my name on the internet. They were typing angry comments, making viral videos, and demanding absolute justice for my supposedly starving family. My children were giving tearful interviews on morning television programs, completely basking in the warm glow of public sympathy. They truly believed they were winning the war because they were controlling the public narrative. But public narratives do not pay the bills. Social media likes do not cover massive high-interest loans. While they were busy performing for the cameras, I was operating in the total, absolute silence of the corporate shadows. I called Arthur Vance to my suite on a quiet Tuesday morning. I poured us both a cup of dark roast coffee and motioned for him to sit across from me at the heavy glass dining table. I did not want to talk about defamation lawsuits or public relations strategies. I wanted to talk about leverage. I wanted to talk about the fundamental mechanics of modern slavery. In this country, you do not need physical chains to bind a person to your will. You only need to own their debt. Debt is the heaviest, most unbreakable chain in the modern world. It dictates where you sleep, what you eat, and how you live every single second of your miserable life. My children had spent their entire adult lives building mountains of irresponsible debt. It was time for me to become the mountain. I instructed Arthur to initiate the most aggressive financial acquisition strategy his firm had ever executed. I wanted Beatrice Holdings, the massive, irrevocable trust named after my beautiful late wife, to officially and legally purchase every single outstanding financial obligation belonging to Darren, Chloe, Maya, and Trent. Naming the company Beatrice Holdings was not just a legal strategy. It was a deeply personal, highly poetic form of ultimate justice. Beatrice was the kindest, most generous woman to ever walk this earth. She loved Darren and Maya with every single ounce of her pure heart. She accepted Trent and Chloe into our family without a single moment of hesitation. She baked them pies, she knitted them warm sweaters, and she forgave their endless selfish mistakes. They took her absolute kindness for weakness. They mistreated her in her final years, dismissing her as a simple, uneducated woman. Now, the very name of the woman they deeply disrespected was the exact legal entity that owned their entire pathetic existence. Every time they wrote a check to keep a roof over their heads, they would be forced to write her beautiful name. It was the perfect vengeance. I did not want to own a percentage of their debt. I wanted to own every single penny. I wanted to become the sole absolute master of their financial survival. Arthur is a man of extreme action. He did not ask questions. He simply opened his briefcase, pulled out his encrypted laptop, and began making the necessary phone calls. We started with the most dangerous problem first. Trent had borrowed $500,000 from highly violent loan sharks to fund his delusional cryptocurrency investments. Buying debt from organized criminals is not like negotiating with a traditional bank. You cannot simply send them an email. You have to speak their language. You have to offer them something they want more than the satisfaction of breaking a man's legs. Arthur used a network of highly discreet corporate fixers who specialized in high-risk offshore transactions. They reached out to the criminal syndicate holding Trent's marker. The negotiation was incredibly brief and ruthlessly efficient. Criminals are ultimately businessmen. They prefer clean, untraceable corporate cash over messy physical violence that attracts police attention. Beatrice Holdings offered them a 20% premium on the original debt paid immediately in untraceable digital funds in exchange for the total legal transfer of the promissory notes. The syndicate gladly accepted the massive payout. They signed the shadowy legal documents, completely washing their hands of Trent. Just like that, the most dangerous, terrifying threat in Trent's life was quietly bought and paid for by the elderly black man he had violently shoved against a concrete pillar. I now legally held a $500,000 sword directly over his neck. Next, we moved on to Darren and Chloe. They were currently living in a beautiful, highly expensive suburban home. They thought they were completely safe because they had secured a massive predatory loan from Apex Horizon Financial Solutions. They had happily signed away the equity of their house and the titles to their luxury cars to stop their immediate financial bleeding. They had absolutely no idea that Apex Horizon was just a hollow shell company completely controlled by my trust. But I wanted to tighten the noose even further. I did not just want the secondary emergency loan, I wanted the primary mortgage. Arthur contacted the major national bank that held the original 30-year mortgage on Darren and Chloe's house. Banks sell bundled debt portfolios all the time. It is a standard, completely legal banking practice. Arthur used the massive financial weight of Beatrice Holdings to aggressively purchase a large block of distressed suburban mortgages, ensuring that Darren and Chloe's specific home loan was buried right in the middle of the acquisition. The National Bank happily unloaded the debt for a massive cash payment. It took less than 48 hours to process the complex paperwork. By Thursday afternoon, the legal deed to the house where Chloe had thrown my clothes on the floor in a garbage bag was securely locked inside Arthur's thick leather briefcase. I owned the roof over their heads. I owned the grass on their lawn. I owned the driveway where they parked their cars. If they missed a single payment by even 1 minute, I had the absolute legal authority to initiate immediate catastrophic foreclosure proceedings. Maya was the easiest target of them all. My biological daughter was a vain, incredibly superficial woman who survived entirely on maximum limit credit cards. She bought expensive imported shoes while ignoring her own children's basic needs. She purchased luxury vacations to the Caribbean while defaulting on her simple utility bills. Her credit rating was an absolute disaster, but the banks kept issuing her cards because she kept paying the minimum balances using the money she used to beg from me. Arthur targeted the specific secondary debt buyers who purchased toxic credit card portfolios from the major banks. Maya had over $200,000 in highly toxic, unsecured revolving debt scattered across 15 different financial institutions. Beatrice Holdings quietly swept through the secondary markets, buying up every single one of her delinquent accounts. We officially consolidated her massive financial failures into one single terrifying legal entity. She thought she was going to use the donation money she raised from her crying internet videos to slowly pay off her shopping addiction. She had absolutely no idea that every single dollar she managed to scam from her gullible social media followers was now legally destined to go straight into my private bank account. I sat at the heavy glass dining table in my penthouse suite watching Arthur compile the final master ledger. It was a beautiful, deeply terrifying document. It represented the total, unmitigated financial capture of 4 human lives. Page after page listed their mortgages, their car loans, their credit card balances, and their dark underworld debts. They owed millions of dollars, and every single red line on that massive spreadsheet pointed directly back to me. I stood up and walked over to the expansive window, looking down at the sprawling city of Atlanta. The sun was slowly setting, casting long, dark shadows over the busy streets below. I took a deep breath of the quiet, conditioned air inside my suite. The sheer scale of the power I now held was almost intoxicating. I had completely stripped away their independence without them even noticing. They were walking around the city, giving interviews, posting videos, and acting like they were the brave, triumphant victims of a cruel tyrant. They thought they were free. They thought they had finally escaped my influence. They did not realize they were dancing on a stage that I entirely owned inside a theater that I completely controlled, wearing heavy iron chains that I had personally forged. I was no longer just their father or their father-in-law. I was their sole absolute creditor. I held the ultimate power of life and death over their entire financial existence. If they wanted to buy groceries, they needed my implicit permission. If they wanted to turn on the lights in their homes, they had to pay my company first. Every single breath they took in their comfortable, privileged lives was now fully subsidized by Beatrice Holdings. Arthur closed his laptop with a soft, satisfying click. He looked up at me from the dining table. "The acquisitions are totally complete, Roland," he said, his voice filled with a deep professional reverence. "Every single piece of paper is signed, sealed, and legally certified. Beatrice Holdings is now the primary and secondary lien holder on all of their major assets. We have total control of their personal debt, their corporate debt, and their property deeds. If you give me the word, I can initiate a coordinated mass default protocol tomorrow morning. We can freeze their bank accounts, repossess their vehicles, and start the eviction process before they even wake up." I turned away from the window and looked at Arthur. A cold, ruthless smile slowly spread across my face. I did not want to crush them while they were sleeping. That would be entirely too easy. That would deny them the absolute horror of realizing exactly who was holding the executioner's axe. I wanted them to feel safe. I wanted them to feel incredibly powerful and completely untouchable. I wanted them to walk into the brightest, most public room in the entire city, fully expecting to be crowned as heroes. And right at the exact moment they reached the highest peak of their ridiculous manufactured glory, I wanted to pull the lever and watch the heavy floor drop out from underneath them. "Do not initiate the defaults yet, Arthur," I instructed him smoothly. "Let them keep their expensive luxury cars for a few more days. Let them sleep comfortably in their stolen beds. Send the standard payment notices through the shell companies so they do not suspect a single thing. We are going to wait for the absolute perfect moment to tighten these chains." Arthur nodded slowly and respectfully, packing the master ledger safely into his thick leather briefcase. He understood the long game perfectly. He knew that revenge is a dish best served in front of a massive captive audience. I poured myself another hot cup of dark, bitter coffee and watched the city lights flicker on in the distance. They threw me out into the freezing winter rain because they thought my old house was the only thing of value I possessed. They were so blinded by their toxic greed that they completely failed to see the massive empire I had built in the shadows. They wanted to play a ruthless game of survival, but they forgot the most important rule of the jungle. You never, ever back a silent predator into a corner unless you are absolutely prepared to be eaten alive. The heavy iron chains were fully purchased, securely fastened, and heavily locked around them. Now all I had to do was patiently wait and give them a violent, inescapable pull. The media is a fascinating and entirely predictable machine. It feeds exclusively on raw emotion and scandalous outrage until a much bigger and much shinier piece of meat is thrown directly into its massive jaws. My daughter-in-law, Chloe, and my biological children had successfully built a towering empire of digital lies on the internet. They had millions of strangers convinced that I was a cruel and abusive monster, hoarding a massive fortune while my own grandchildren were actively starving. They controlled the cheap emotional narrative of social media. But I was not interested in fighting a digital war with angry teenagers and gullible internet strangers. I was interested in absolute institutional power. I wanted to completely shift the tectonic plates of the entire city. I called my wealth management attorney, Arthur Vance, and told him it was time to officially change the public conversation. We were going to bypass the internet entirely and go straight to the most respected financial and philanthropic institutions in the state of Georgia. I instructed Arthur to draft a massive legally binding press release announcing the official launch of the Beatrice Foundation. I named it after my beautiful late wife because she was the true architect of our family wealth. She was the one who saw the brilliant potential in that barren plot of dirt over 30 years ago. She was a woman who believed deeply in the power of education, hard work, and community uplift. The press release boldly announced that the Beatrice Foundation was being established with a staggering initial endowment of $40 million in pure liquid cash. The foundation had one specific and highly targeted mission. It was created to provide massive debt-free financial grants and comprehensive business mentorship to young, brilliant Black entrepreneurs across the city of Atlanta. I wanted to take the exact wealth that Trent and Chloe felt they inherently deserved and use it to build up the exact demographic of people they constantly looked down upon. Trent was a mediocre white man who deeply believed that his absolute failures were somehow better than my lifelong successes. He believed that a Black man from the working class had no business controlling $50 million. So I deliberately structured the entire charitable foundation to empower young Black men and women who possess the actual drive, intelligence, and relentless work ethic that my own children completely lacked. I wanted to build a towering monument to Black excellence, using the very money my greedy family had tried to steal from me in the dark. Arthur Vance distributed the press release to every major news network, financial publication, and political office in the state. He did not send it to cheap gossip blogs. He sent it to the Wall Street Journal, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and the major television broadcast networks. The impact was absolutely instantaneous and incredibly explosive. The news of a secret working-class Black contractor suddenly emerging as a massive philanthropic titan completely dominated the headlines. The traditional media did not care about Chloe and her fake crying videos on the internet. They cared about the fact that $40 million was suddenly being injected directly into the local economy by a man nobody had ever heard of. The public narrative began to fracture immediately. The people on the internet who had been violently attacking my character suddenly found themselves deeply confused. They could not logically reconcile the image of a selfish, abusive patriarch with the reality of a man giving away $40 million to empower marginalized youth. The local politicians and city leaders immediately began praising my name. They called me a visionary and a true hero of the community. The massive wave of public goodwill completely crushed the pathetic little sandcastle of lies that my children had spent weeks building online. To officially launch the foundation, I directed Arthur to organize the most opulent, ultra-luxurious, 5-star charity gala the city had ever seen. We booked the grand ballroom of the most prestigious hotel in downtown Atlanta. I spared absolutely no expense. I wanted the event to drip with undeniable, overwhelming wealth. We hired award-winning executive chefs to curate a massive 5-course dining experience. We brought in a world-renowned symphony orchestra to provide the musical entertainment. We decorated the sprawling ballroom with tens of thousands of imported white roses, which were Beatrice's absolute favorite flower. The guest list was a highly exclusive collection of the most powerful people in the state. We invited the mayor, sitting senators, prominent business leaders, and highly successful entrepreneurs. It was the social event of the entire decade, and my name was printed in shining gold letters at the very top of the velvet invitations. I knew exactly what would happen the very second that press release hit the television screens in the miserable bedbug-infested motel where my children were currently hiding. My private investigator had informed me that the heavy financial chains I had silently wrapped around their necks were severely restricting their breathing. Their stolen donation money had been frozen by the online platforms due to suspicious activity. They were broke, desperate, and watching their fake public victim narrative slowly collapse under the massive weight of my newly announced philanthropy. I sat in my penthouse watching the security feed from the hidden camera my investigator had managed to place near the window of their cheap motel room. Trent was pacing back and forth across the stained carpet, staring at the small television screen mounted on the wall. The local news anchor was actively discussing the $40 million endowment of the Beatrice Foundation. Trent looked absolutely sick to his stomach. He was doing the mathematical calculations in his head. He knew the land deal was worth $50 million. Hearing that, $40 million was being permanently locked away in a charitable trust meant that the massive fortune he felt entitled to was rapidly disappearing into thin air. He grabbed a cheap plastic chair and threw it against the motel wall, cursing loudly about how unfair the entire universe was to him. Maya was sitting on the edge of the sagging mattress, biting her fingernails down to the quick. She stared at the television screen with wide, panicked eyes. She complained loudly that I was giving away her rightful inheritance to complete strangers. She completely ignored the fact that she had personally stood by and watched her husband try to physically kidnap me in a parking garage. She still genuinely believed that simply being my biological daughter meant she was automatically entitled to millions of dollars. Her vanity and absolute selfishness completely blinded her to the reality of her horrific actions. Darren sat in the corner of the room, rubbing his temples in extreme frustration. He muttered that they had played the game completely wrong. He realized that attacking me publicly had only forced me to solidify my wealth in a highly public, legally untouchable charitable trust. He told the others that they had completely underestimated my intelligence and my willingness to scorch the earth. But it was Chloe who formulated the final catastrophic plan that would lead them directly into my ultimate trap. I watched on the hidden camera feed as Chloe stood up and walked to the center of the cramped room. Her eyes were wide with a manic, desperate kind of hope. She told the group that all was not lost. She pointed out that I was only giving away $40 million. She quickly did the math and announced that there was still $10 million left in my private accounts. She convinced them that this highly publicized charity gala was actually their absolute last chance at financial salvation. Chloe spun a wildly delusional narrative. She told them that wealthy philanthropists cared about nothing more than their public image. She argued that a man hosting a massive charity event honoring his late wife would absolutely hate the optics of a messy, unresolved family feud bleeding into the spotlight. She completely convinced Darren, Maya, and Trent that if they showed up at the glamorous gala dressed perfectly and staged a massive emotional public apology in front of all the cameras and the politicians, I would have absolutely no choice but to forgive them. She confidently stated that I would be too embarrassed to reject my own crying children in front of the mayor and the elite business class. She told them they could use the intense public pressure of the event to force me into a fake reconciliation, effectively securing their access to the remaining $10 million. It was a brilliantly stupid plan built entirely on breathtaking arrogance and total delusion. They truly believed they could manipulate me in public simply by weaponizing their fake tears one more time. They did not realize that I had deliberately designed the entire charity gala for this exact specific reason. I wanted them to come. I needed them to come. I instructed my massive security detail of former military operators to maintain a tight perimeter around the grand ballroom, but I explicitly ordered them to leave one specific side entrance completely unguarded. I laid out a luxurious red carpet leading directly into a steel bear trap, and they were sprinting toward it with absolute joy. The preparations they made to crash the party were incredibly pathetic and entirely shameless. My private investigator tracked their financial movements closely. Despite being completely broke and facing massive predatory loans from my secret shell company, they managed to scrape together their very last remaining pennies to maintain their fake affluent image. Maya pawned the last of her expensive designer handbags just to secure enough cash to rent a high-fashion evening gown. She spent hours doing her hair and makeup in the filthy motel bathroom, desperately trying to look like a wealthy heiress instead of a completely ruined woman. Trent and Darren went to a high-end tuxedo rental shop downtown. They maxed out a high-interest payday loan to afford premium velvet dinner jackets and polished leather shoes. They wanted to look like successful, sophisticated businessmen who naturally belonged in a room full of millionaires. Darren stood in front of the cracked mirror in the motel, actively rehearsing his fake apology speech. I listened through the audio feed as he practiced his lines, injecting fake sorrow and manufactured tears into his voice. He practiced saying how much he missed his mother Beatrice and how he had been blinded by stress. It was a sickening, entirely hollow performance. Chloe used the last of her hidden emergency cash to rent a stunning floor-length silver gown. She practiced her devastated, loving daughter-in-law routine with chilling precision. She told the group that when they walked into the ballroom, they needed to immediately locate the highest concentration of news cameras and stage their emotional reunion right in the center of the flashing lights. They genuinely thought they were the main characters in a movie arriving at the very last minute to save the day and reclaim their glorious fortune. They felt incredibly smart. They felt like masterful manipulators who were about to successfully hijack my entire charitable legacy. They had absolutely no concept of the total, unmitigated destruction that was waiting for them behind the heavy velvet curtains of the grand ballroom. They thought they were crashing a party to steal $10 million. They did not know they were actually dressing up in expensive rental tuxedos and high-fashion gowns just to attend their own very public execution. I stood in my penthouse on the evening of the gala looking closely at my reflection in the tall glass mirror. I was wearing a custom-tailored midnight blue tuxedo with a subtle black lapel. I adjusted my silk bow tie and checked the heavy gold watch on my wrist. I felt a deep, profound sense of calm wash over my entire body. I thought about my beautiful Beatrice. I thought about how much she would have loved the gorgeous white roses decorating the ballroom. I thought about the countless young black entrepreneurs whose lives were going to be permanently changed by the $40 million foundation we had built from the dirt. And then I thought about the 4 parasites currently riding in a cheap taxi toward the hotel, completely unaware that their entire lives were about to end on a massive high-definition screen. I smiled a cold, razor-sharp smile. The trap was perfectly set. The bait had been completely swallowed. It was finally time to pull the heavy iron lever and let the floor drop. I turned away from the mirror, walked out of my suite, and headed down to the grand ballroom to properly welcome my highly anticipated, entirely uninvited guests. The grand ballroom of the downtown hotel was completely transformed into a breathtaking palace of absolute luxury. Tens of thousands of imported white roses cascaded from the vaulted ceilings and wrapped around the massive crystal chandeliers. The sweet scent of the fresh flowers completely filled the air, honoring the beautiful memory of my late wife, Beatrice. A world-class symphony orchestra played soft classical music in the corner, providing the perfect soundtrack for the most exclusive social event of the entire decade. Waiters in crisp white jackets moved gracefully through the crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with premium champagne and expensive culinary delicacies. The room was packed with the absolute elite of Atlanta. Sitting senators, the city mayor, powerful corporate executives, and highly successful business leaders mingled together under the bright lights. I stood on the elevated balcony overlooking the main floor, holding a glass of sparkling water completely hidden in the shadows. I watched the heavy oak doors at the side of the ballroom carefully. I had specifically instructed my private security detail to leave that one single entrance completely unguarded. I knew my greedy children were coming tonight. I could practically feel their desperate, toxic energy approaching the building. Right on schedule, the heavy side doors pushed open. Darren, Maya Trent, and Chloe strutted into the brightly lit ballroom. They looked absolutely ridiculous, but they carried themselves with the breathtaking arrogance of people who genuinely believed they owned the entire world. Darren was wearing a cheap rental tuxedo that was slightly too tight across his broad shoulders. Maya walked beside him in a rented evening gown, her neck completely bare because she had pawned every single piece of jewelry she owned just to afford the dress. Trent marched forward with his chest puffed out, wearing a velvet dinner jacket that he bought using a high-interest payday loan. Chloe trailed slightly behind them, wrapped in a silver floor-length gown, turning her head rapidly in every direction to locate the news cameras. They approached the main reception desk, where a polite young woman holding a digital guest list asked for their invitations. I watched from the balcony as Chloe stepped right up to the desk, completely invading the personal space of the young worker. Chloe puffed out her chest and loudly declared that they did not need physical invitations. She proudly announced that they were the direct family of the founder. She claimed they were the highly anticipated guests of honor for the entire evening. The young woman at the desk looked confused, but I had already given strict, silent orders to the event staff. The worker smiled politely, unhooked the velvet rope, and allowed the 4 parasites to walk directly into the heart of the gala. The sheer audacity of their behavior was truly something to behold. They were currently living in a filthy bed-bug-infested motel room on the bad side of town. They were facing massive predatory loans that were about to completely destroy their lives. They had absolutely $0 in their frozen bank accounts. But the very second they stepped onto the plush carpet of the grand ballroom, they immediately began acting like billionaire philanthropists. They completely separated and began aggressively working the room. Trent immediately targeted a group of highly successful technology investors standing near the expansive bar. He casually leaned against the counter, swirling a glass of stolen champagne, and started talking loudly about imaginary digital startups and fake cryptocurrency investments. He was actively trying to network with actual billionaires, pretending that he was a massive player in the financial tech industry. He laughed loudly at their jokes, clapping them on the back, completely desperate to secure a new source of funding before his violent loan sharks finally caught up with him. He had no idea that the men he was trying to impress were actually close personal friends of mine, and they already knew exactly who he was and what he had done to me. On the other side of the massive room, Chloe was aggressively cornering the city mayor and a group of influential local politicians. She was flashing her bright fake smile, handing out invisible business cards, and loudly introducing herself as the primary director of the Beatrice Foundation. She was actively trying to steal the credit for my $40 million charitable donation. She talked smoothly about how deeply her family cared for the marginalized youth of Atlanta. She used all the correct political buzzwords, pretending to be a highly compassionate, socially aware advocate for the poor. It was absolutely sickening to watch her perform. This was the exact same woman who had completely forged real estate documents to steal a house, and who had paid a corrupt doctor $10,000 to lock me inside a psychiatric ward. She was standing in a rented dress, drinking free champagne, and boldly lying directly to the highest elected officials in the state. Maya and Darren were busy hunting down the local news crews. They were posing for the flashing cameras, wrapping their arms around each other, acting like the perfect loving children of a generous patriarch. I watched them perform their pathetic circus act for exactly 20 minutes. I let them drink the expensive champagne. I let them shake hands with the politicians. I let them feel the intoxicating rush of high society validation. And then I slowly walked down the grand staircase from the balcony and stepped directly onto the main ballroom floor. The crowd naturally parted ways for me. People smiled and nodded respectfully as I walked past them. I made my way straight toward the center of the room where Darren, Maya, Trent, and Chloe had finally regrouped near a massive floral arrangement. Darren saw me first. The fake, confident smile instantly vanished from his face. All the color drained completely out of his cheeks. He nudged Trent nervously in the ribs. Trent spun around and his eyes widened in pure, unadulterated panic. Chloe froze entirely, her champagne glass stopping halfway to her mouth. Maya physically took a step backward, trying to hide behind her older brother. They braced themselves for a massive, violent confrontation. They fully expected me to scream at them. They expected me to signal my massive security detail to physically drag them out of the ballroom in front of the entire city elite. But I did not raise my voice. I did not call for the heavily armed guards. I walked right up to them with a calm, warm, and highly welcoming smile on my face. "Good evening, my dear family," I said smoothly, my voice projecting just loud enough for the surrounding politicians and wealthy investors to hear. "I am so incredibly glad you could make it to this wonderful celebration. We are honoring your mother tonight, and it simply would not be a real party without her beloved children here to witness it." Trent blinked rapidly, completely thrown off balance by my polite greeting. Chloe exchanged a highly confused, nervous glance with Darren. They had come here prepared to stage a massive fake apology scene to prevent me from throwing them out. They had practiced crying and begging in their cheap motel room. They did not expect me to welcome them with open arms. Darren cleared his throat, trying to quickly regain his fake confidence. "We would never miss this." Dad, Darren lied, smoothly forcing a tight smile. "We know we have had some minor disagreements recently, but family is family. We are here to support you and honor Mom tonight." I nodded slowly, maintaining my perfect, friendly facade. "I know exactly why you are here, Darren," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly pleasant so the surrounding guests would suspect absolutely nothing. "Please follow me. I have reserved a very special place just for the four of you." I turned around and gestured for them to follow me through the crowded ballroom. We walked directly toward the very front of the massive room, right up to the edge of the beautifully illuminated main stage. There was a large circular table positioned dead center in the front row. It was the absolute best table in the entire building. It was surrounded by multiple news cameras, professional photographers, and powerful studio lighting. The table was dressed in pristine white linen and covered in expensive crystal glassware. I pulled out a chair and gestured for Chloe to sit down. "Please make yourselves completely comfortable," I told them politely. "You are the family of the founder. You deserve to be right here in the front row where everyone can see you clearly. Trent sat down next to Chloe, completely unable to hide the massive, arrogant smirk forming on his face. Darren and Maya quickly took their seats, looking around at the flashing cameras with absolute delight. They fell for the trap completely. They did not see the executioner standing right behind them. They only saw the flashing lights and the comfortable chairs. I watched their body language instantly change. The panic and desperation were entirely gone. They leaned back in their plush seats, whispering quietly to each other, completely convinced that they had just won the ultimate victory. I could see the smug, toxic satisfaction radiating from their faces. They genuinely believed that I was too embarrassed to cause a scene in front of the mayor. They thought I was too concerned about my new public image as a wealthy philanthropist to expose our dark family secrets. They thought my polite invitation to the VIP table was a clear signal of my complete and total surrender. They thought they had successfully manipulated me into bringing them back into the $50 million fold. I smiled down at them one last time. "Enjoy the champagne," I said softly. "The main presentation will begin very shortly. I want you to pay very close attention to the screens." I turned around and walked away from the VIP table, leaving them to bask in their false glory. I made my way toward the backstage area where my technical director was waiting patiently by the audio and visual control boards. I looked back at the ballroom floor. Trent was actively laughing, raising his glass in a toast with Darren. Chloe was fixing her hair for the cameras, and Maya was smiling brightly at the photographers. They were sitting exactly where I wanted them. They were perfectly positioned in the absolute center of the spotlight, surrounded by the most powerful people in the entire state of Georgia. They thought they were the honored guests of a royal banquet. They had absolutely no idea that I had just strapped them directly into the electric chair, and the entire world was about to watch me pull the switch. The symphony orchestra brought their beautiful classical performance to a smooth and elegant close. The gentle hum of conversation among the hundreds of wealthy guests slowly faded into a respectful silence as the main ballroom lights dimmed. Bright, warm spotlights illuminated the massive stage at the very front of the room. Behind the sleek acrylic podium stood a towering state-of-the-art high-definition screen currently displaying the elegant gold logo of the Beatrice Foundation. The air in the room was thick with absolute anticipation. The mayor of Atlanta, a charismatic man dressed in a sharp black tuxedo, stepped up to the microphone to officially begin the evening proceedings. He spoke passionately about the future of the city, the importance of investing in young black entrepreneurs, and the incredible generosity of a man who had completely avoided the public spotlight until tonight. Every single camera in the room turned toward the stage. The red recording lights blinked continuously, broadcasting the highly anticipated event live to local news stations and online platforms. I stood quietly in the dark backstage area, watching the live feed on a dedicated production monitor. The camera operators frequently cut to the front row, focusing directly on the VIP table where my children were sitting. Trent and Chloe were leaning back in their plush chairs, sipping premium champagne, whispering to each other with incredibly smug smiles on their faces. They looked entirely convinced that they had successfully infiltrated the castle and secured their permanent place in high society. They had no idea that they were currently living inside a financial death trap completely controlled by my holding company. They only saw the bright lights and the expensive crystal glassware. The mayor finished his opening remarks with a grand flourish. He looked out at the massive crowd and smiled warmly. Before we hear from the visionary founder himself, the mayor announced, his voice echoing powerfully through the massive speakers, we have a very special opportunity to hear from the people who know him best. The legacy of Beatrice Sinclair lives on not just through this magnificent $40 million foundation, but through her beautiful family. Please welcome to the stage the children of Roland and Beatrice Sinclair. A wave of polite, enthusiastic applause washed over the grand ballroom. At the VIP table, Darren and Maya exchanged a quick, highly calculated look. They stood up simultaneously, smoothing the fabric of their cheap rental outfits. They plastered expressions of deep, humbling gratitude onto their faces. They walked up the short flight of stairs to the main stage, moving with the practiced grace of professional actors. They were entirely in their element. They loved the flashing lights. They craved the public attention. They were absolutely thrilled to stand in front of the most powerful people in the state and pretend to be the loving, devoted heirs to a massive philanthropic empire. They completely forgot the fact that just 2 weeks ago they had violently thrown me out of my own house into the freezing rain. They forgot about the forged real estate deeds, the corrupt psychiatrists, and the violent parking garage assault. They only cared about the cameras pointing directly at their faces and the remaining $10 million they desperately wanted to steal from my private accounts. Darren reached the acrylic podium first. He gripped the edges with both hands, lowering his head for a brief, dramatic moment as if he was trying to collect his deeply emotional thoughts. He looked out at the sea of wealthy investors, senators, and elite business leaders. "Thank you all for being here tonight." Darren began, his voice perfectly modulated to sound both strong and incredibly vulnerable. "My father, Roland Sinclair, is a man of very few words. He is a man of absolute action. Growing up, I watched him work his fingers to the bone just to put food on our table. I watched him sacrifice every single personal comfort so that my sister and I could have the opportunities he never had." Darren paused, taking a slow, shaky breath. He actually managed to produce a single, highly convincing tear that rolled down his right cheek. He wiped it away bravely, playing the role of the proud, deeply moved son to absolute perfection. The crowd was completely captivated. Women in expensive designer gowns looked on with deep sympathy. Darren continued his disgusting monologue, spinning a completely fabricated narrative about our tight-knit family bond. He told a fake story about how I used to stay up late helping him with his business plans, claiming I was his greatest mentor and his absolute best friend. He said our family had faced minor challenges, as all families do, but that our deep, unbreakable love for each other always prevailed in the end. He spoke with such intense manufactured passion that a complete stranger would absolutely believe he worshipped the very ground I walked on. I watched him on the backstage monitor. My stomach turned with pure, unadulterated disgust. This was the exact same man who had aggressively grabbed me by the collar of my winter coat in a dark parking garage, threatening to break my fingers if I did not sign over my $50 million trust fund. Now he was standing in the bright lights, claiming I was his personal hero. The sheer level of toxic hypocrisy was almost difficult to comprehend. He was painting a masterpiece of deception right in front of the local media, firmly believing that he was successfully trapping me in a public corner. He thought that if he said enough nice things about me on television, I would be entirely forced to forgive him, to maintain the peaceful, charitable atmosphere of the gala. Before Darren could even finish his elaborate closing statement, Maya stepped forward and smoothly pushed him slightly away from the microphone. She was not going to let her brother steal all the public sympathy and media attention. She grabbed the microphone stand, her rented silver evening gown sparkling under the bright stage lights. She looked directly into the main television camera lens, her eyes wide and perfectly shining with fake, unshed tears. "When we lost my mother, Beatrice, 5 years ago, it felt like the light had completely gone out of our lives," Maya said, her voice shaking with expertly crafted sorrow. "But my father, this incredibly strong, incredibly resilient man, he held our broken family together. He has always been our solid rock. He has always been our safe harbor in the darkest, most terrifying storms." Maya placed a hand over her heart, closing her eyes for a brief second to let the audience feel her supposed emotional pain. She continued to lie with breathtaking sociopathic ease. She told the crowded room how much I loved my grandchildren completely, ignoring the fact that she had recently posted viral internet videos claiming I was intentionally starving them to death. She talked about how this $40 million foundation was the ultimate testament to our family's deeply rooted values of generosity, kindness, and community love. She painted a beautiful, completely fake picture of a wealthy, united family standing together to change the world for the better. She spoke about unity, mutual respect, and the sacred, unbreakable bond between a father and his children. It was an absolute masterclass in psychological manipulation. She was utilizing the exact same fake victim strategy that Chloe had successfully used on social media, but she was performing it live in front of the absolute highest echelon of Atlanta society. She wanted the mayor to see her as a grieving, loving daughter. She wanted the billionaire investors to see her as a sophisticated, charitable heiress. She was aggressively claiming her position at the top of the social hierarchy, totally convinced that her dark criminal secrets were permanently buried in the past. I stood in the dark shadows just a few feet away from the heavy velvet stage curtains. I listened to every single word they spoke. I heard the elite audience politely clapping, completely moved by the beautiful, heartwarming display of family devotion. The wealthy guests at the VIP tables were delicately dabbing their eyes with white linen napkins. The local politicians were nodding their heads in deep, profound respect. Trent and Chloe were clapping loudly from the front row, looking incredibly proud of their masterful deception. They had successfully hijacked the narrative of the entire evening. They firmly believed they had just publicly secured their position as the rightful heirs to my remaining fortune. They thought they had trapped me completely. They assumed that after such a beautiful, highly publicized display of affection, I would be entirely forced to walk out onto the stage, hug them tightly in front of the flashing cameras, and officially welcome them back into my life. They thought my pride and my new public image as a generous philanthropist would completely prevent me from exposing the ugly, horrifying truth to the media. They thought they had finally outsmarted the old man. The crowd erupted into a massive, sustained round of applause as Maya finished her beautiful speech and hugged Darren tightly right in the center of the stage. The flashing lights of the press cameras illuminated their smiling faces. The mayor returned to the acrylic podium, beaming with genuine happiness. And now the mayor announced, his voice booming with intense excitement. Please welcome the man of the hour, the true visionary behind the Beatrice Foundation, Mr. Roland Sinclair. The live symphony orchestra immediately began to play a triumphant, soaring piece of classical music. The entire ballroom stood up, offering a massive, deafening standing ovation before I even stepped into the light. I took a deep, steady breath. I adjusted the lapels of my custom-tailored midnight blue tuxedo. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, black remote control, holding it tightly in my right hand. The stage was perfectly set. The wealthy audience was completely captivated. The media cameras were rolling and broadcasting live to the entire city. My children were standing right there in the center of the blinding spotlight, totally exposed, incredibly arrogant, and entirely convinced they had won the absolute final victory. They had built their towering skyscraper of lies to the absolute highest possible altitude. They were standing on the very edge of the roof, looking down at the world, feeling completely invincible. It was finally time to walk out there, look them dead in their greedy eyes, and push them right off the edge into the dark abyss. The deafening sound of a standing ovation washed over me like a massive physical wave as I stepped out from the dark shadows of the backstage area. The live symphony orchestra swelled to a magnificent crescendo, filling the grand ballroom with an incredibly triumphant melody. Hundreds of the most wealthy and powerful people in Atlanta were on their feet, clapping enthusiastically, their faces glowing under the warm golden light of the massive crystal chandeliers. I walked slowly and deliberately up the short flight of carpeted stairs toward the center of the main stage. I did not rush. I wanted to feel every single second of this highly anticipated moment. My custom-tailored midnight blue tuxedo felt like a suit of armor. In my right hand, completely hidden inside the pocket of my trousers, my fingers traced the smooth plastic edges of a small black remote control. It was the detonator for the explosive device I was about to drop directly onto my greedy family. As I reached the sleek acrylic podium, the applause slowly began to fade into a deeply respectful silence. The bright television studio lights momentarily blinded me, but I quickly adjusted my vision to see the massive sea of elite guests sitting before me. The mayor of the city gave me a warm, highly approving nod from his seat in the front row. Sitting just a few feet away from him at the exclusive VIP table were Darren, Maya, Trent, and Chloe. They were looking up at me with incredibly bright, manufactured smiles. Darren puffed out his chest, looking like the proudest son in the entire universe. Maya wiped a fake tear from her eye for the benefit of the local news cameras positioned right behind their table. They honestly believed that their disgusting theatrical performance had worked perfectly. They thought they had successfully manipulated the narrative and trapped me in a public corner where I would be forced to play the role of the forgiving, loving patriarch. They thought the $10 million remaining in my private accounts was completely guaranteed to be theirs. I rested my hands flat on the edges of the clear podium and looked out over the massive crowd. Thank you all for being here tonight, I began, keeping my voice incredibly smooth, deep, and perfectly resonant through the state-of-the-art sound system. We are gathered in this beautiful room to honor the magnificent legacy of my late wife, Beatrice. She was a woman of extraordinary vision, boundless generosity, and absolute integrity. She believed that wealth was only meaningful if it was used to build a foundation of ultimate truth and profound justice. She despised deception above all other things. She believed that the light of truth must always shine brightly, no matter how uncomfortable or how painful that truth might be. I paused and looked directly down at the VIP table. The smiles on the faces of my children faltered for just a fraction of a second. A very subtle wave of confusion passed over Darren. Chloe shifted uncomfortably in her rented silver gown. They expected me to start talking about their beautiful speeches. They expected me to publicly thank them for their kind words. Instead, I was talking about deception. My daughter Maya and my son Darren just shared some incredibly moving stories about our deep family bond. I continued, my voice echoing powerfully across the silent ballroom. They painted a beautiful, heartwarming picture of absolute loyalty and unconditional love. But as I said, Beatrice valued the absolute truth above all else. And the truth is that words are very easy to fabricate. Anyone can stand in front of a camera and recite a beautiful script. Real truth is found in our actions when we think nobody is watching. Tonight, before we officially launch this $40 million foundation, I want to share a short visual presentation that perfectly illustrates the exact type of family loyalty my children just spoke about. I pulled my right hand out of my pocket. I raised the small black remote control high in the air so everyone in the room could see it clearly. I did not look at the screen behind me. I kept my eyes locked completely on the terrified, rapidly paling faces of my children in the front row. I pressed the primary button firmly. The warm, golden lighting in the grand ballroom instantly plunged into complete darkness. The massive high-definition LED screen towering behind the podium flashed brightly to life. The audience expected to see a heartwarming slideshow of family photographs or a touching tribute video to my late wife. Instead, the screen displayed crisp, high-definition security footage of the interior of my private bedroom. The timestamp in the corner of the video clearly indicated it was recorded exactly 2 weeks ago, late at night. The state-of-the-art audio system in the ballroom was designed to amplify a full symphony orchestra. When the audio from the security footage kicked in, it boomed through the massive hall with absolutely terrifying volume. The sound of my bedroom door being violently kicked open echoed like a gunshot. The elite audience physically jumped in their seats. On the massive screen, a 50-foot-tall version of Chloe marched aggressively into my bedroom. Her face was twisted into a malicious, hateful scowl that was the complete opposite of the sweet, loving woman who had just been shaking hands with the mayor. "Get your things and get out," Chloe hissed through the massive speakers, her voice echoing violently across the stunned ballroom. "You are leaving tonight, Roland. We are absolutely done playing caretaker for a useless old man. You sit in this big house taking up space while your family is struggling." A collective gasp of pure unadulterated horror rippled through the hundreds of wealthy guests. The mayor sat frozen in his chair, his eyes wide with absolute disbelief. The local news cameras quickly pivoted from the stage directly toward the VIP table, desperately trying to capture the real-time reactions of my family. Darren was gripping the edges of his table so tightly his knuckles were completely white. Trent looked like he was about to physically vomit onto the pristine white linen tablecloth. Maya was shaking her head rapidly, whispering the word no over and over again in pure panic. The video on the massive screen continued to play mercilessly. The audience watched in total silent shock as Darren and Trent walked into the frame. They watched my biological son stand there with his hands in his pockets, completely refusing to defend his own father. They listened as Trent arrogantly declared that they had forged a real estate deed to steal my home and pay off his massive gambling debts. The audio of Trent claiming the house was dead equity boomed through the grand hall. The wealthy investors and corporate leaders in the audience looked at Trent with absolute disgust. He had just spent the last hour trying to network with them, pretending to be a successful technology entrepreneur. Now the entire city knew he was a desperate, failing gambler who attempted to violently evict an elderly man to save his own pathetic life. The video cut to the moment I walked out of the front door into the freezing, pouring rain. The visual of a 74-year-old man being thrown out into a winter storm by his own laughing children was incredibly powerful. Women in the audience were covering their mouths in horror. Several prominent business leaders were shaking their heads in deep, profound anger. But the public execution was not even close to being finished. The screen briefly faded to black before a new video began to play. This footage was recorded by my private investigator in the dark, dimly lit parking garage. The video quality was crystal clear, and the audio was perfectly enhanced. The 50-foot screen showed Trent nervously pacing back and forth before handing a thick, bulging manila envelope entirely filled with stolen cash to the corrupt psychiatrist. "We need you to sign the medical certificate today," Trent said. On the massive video, his desperate voice amplified for the entire elite society of Atlanta to hear clearly. "We need the document to say he has late-stage Alzheimer's disease. We have to establish a full legal conservatorship by Monday so I can lock the old man in a psychiatric ward and drain his $50 million trust account." The ballroom erupted into a chaotic symphony of shocked murmurs and angry whispers. Medical fraud and elder abuse were severe, highly stigmatized crimes in this community. The politicians who had just been smiling at Trent and Chloe now looked at them as if they were covered in a highly contagious disease. The mayor leaned over and whispered something aggressively to his chief of staff, clearly distancing himself from the toxic radiation currently destroying the VIP table. But I still had one final nail to drive directly into their coffin. The parking garage video faded out, and the massive screen was suddenly filled with highly detailed certified financial documents. They were the exact bank trails and wire transfer receipts proving that Chloe had completely forged my signature to steal tens of thousands of dollars from my accounts. The screen displayed her unauthorized luxury purchases, her expensive vacations, and her failed attempt to illegally sell my home to a corporate cash buyer. Her professional reputation as a real estate agent, which had already been severely damaged behind closed doors, was now being completely pulverized on a live television broadcast. I pressed the small button on the remote control one final time. The massive screen behind me faded to a solid, stark white background, displaying only the elegant gold logo of the Beatrice Foundation. The bright, warm spotlights slowly illuminated the main stage once again. The deafening silence that filled the grand ballroom was heavier and more suffocating than anything I had ever experienced in my entire life. Nobody moved. Nobody clapped. Hundreds of the most powerful people in the state simply stared at the four individuals sitting in the front row. I leaned forward into the acrylic podium. I looked directly down at my children. Their fake, hypocritical masks were entirely destroyed. Their carefully constructed narrative of being loving, devoted heirs was completely burned to the ground. They were totally exposed as the greedy, manipulative, violent predators they truly were. "That is the absolute truth about my family," I said calmly into the microphone, my voice slicing through the heavy silence of the ballroom. "They did not come here tonight to honor their mother. They came here to stage a fake apology because they found out I have money. They came here to smile for the cameras and manipulate the public. But Beatrice Holdings does not reward betrayal, and the Beatrice Foundation will never be touched by their greedy hands." The sheer level of public humiliation was absolutely spectacular to witness. The local news camera operators completely surrounded the VIP table, shoving their bright lenses directly into the faces of my children. Darren tried to cover his face with his hands, shrinking down into his rented tuxedo jacket. Maya burst into genuine hysterical tears of absolute shame, realizing that every single person in her elite social circle was currently watching her catastrophic downfall on live television. Trent could not handle the intense, suffocating pressure of the collective disgust focused entirely on him. He abruptly pushed his chair back with incredible force. The chair tipped over and crashed loudly against the floor. He grabbed Chloe by the arm, and the two of them desperately scrambled away from the table. They did not try to defend themselves. They did not try to offer a fake explanation. There is absolutely no defense against undeniable high-definition truth. They ran. They fled the grand ballroom like frightened, cowardly insects scrambling away from a bright light. Darren and Maya quickly followed them, practically tripping over their own feet in their desperate rush to escape the flashing cameras and the angry, judging eyes of the entire city. They kept their heads down, shielding their faces with their hands, pushing past the waiters and the security guards as they sprinted toward the main exit doors. I stood at the podium and watched them run away. I did not feel a single ounce of regret. I did not feel any sorrow for the absolute destruction of their lives. They had actively chosen this path the very second they threw my clothes into a garbage bag. I had simply turned on the lights so the rest of the world could see exactly who they were. The public execution was completely flawless. They were financially ruined, legally trapped, and now entirely exiled from any respectable society. I took a deep, satisfying breath, smiled warmly at the shocked audience, and prepared to officially launch my foundation. The heavy iron chains were now fully locked, and my children were finally falling into the dark, bottomless abyss they had dug for themselves. The sun rose over the city of Atlanta, casting a bright golden light across the skyline. I sat on the balcony of my penthouse suite, drinking freshly brewed dark roast coffee. The air was crisp and completely still. Inside my suite, the television played the local morning news on a low volume. The absolute destruction of my children was the only topic being discussed across every single channel. The video I played at the gala had leaked to the press immediately. It was playing on a continuous loop on national television. The internet, which previously crowned Chloe and Maya as tragic victims, violently turned against them with the ruthless efficiency of a starving predator. They were being crucified in the court of public opinion. Their social media accounts were flooded with thousands of disgusted comments. They locked their profiles and turned off their phones, desperately trying to hide from the digital hurricane they intentionally created. But there is absolutely no hiding from the truth once it is fully exposed to the bright light of day. I did not care about their public humiliation anymore. The social destruction was simply the appetizer. It was time to serve the main course. I picked up my phone and called my wealth management attorney, Arthur Vance. I told him to execute the final phase of our financial operation. Arthur structured the predatory loans from Apex Horizon Financial Solutions with devastating ironclad precision. When Trent, Chloe, Darren, and Maya signed those heavy contracts, they agreed to extremely strict behavioral clauses. The contracts contained a specific moral turpitude provision and a severe criminal activity cross-default clause. Because they were officially under federal investigation for medical fraud and Chloe was fired for felony document forgery, they were in catastrophic breach. They legally defaulted on every single penny they owed to my shell company. The penalty for this specific default was the immediate acceleration of their entire debt. The total balance was due instantly, and the company had the absolute legal right to execute an immediate foreclosure and asset seizure without waiting for a lengthy judicial review. I instructed my private investigator to position his teams outside both of their expensive residences to capture the final moments of their luxurious lives. I wanted to watch them lose everything in real time. At exactly 8:00 in the morning, a convoy of heavy vehicles pulled into their respective neighborhoods. At Trent and Maya's highly overpriced modern townhouse, the morning silence was shattered by the aggressive sound of heavy diesel engines and clanking metal chains. Two massive tow trucks backed directly into their pristine concrete driveway. At the exact same moment, 3 marked police cruisers from the county sheriff's department parked along the curb, their lights flashing brightly. 4 heavily armed deputies walked up the manicured front walkway, accompanied by 2 stern bailiffs holding thick legal clipboards. The lead deputy raised his heavy fist and pounded on the custom wooden front door with enough force to shake the entire frame. The aggressive pounding echoed continuously until Trent finally opened the door. Trent looked absolutely pathetic. He was wearing the same wrinkled clothes from the disastrous gala last night. His eyes were bloodshot and his face was pale with pure exhaustion. He looked at the armed officers on his porch and the tow trucks hooking thick metal chains to his least luxury sports cars. He immediately puffed out his chest, defaulting to his usual arrogance. He demanded to know what was going on. He loudly threatened to call the police chief, claiming this was an illegal harassment campaign. The lead deputy did not flinch. He did not care about Trent's imaginary technology empire or his expensive zip code. He simply handed Trent a thick, heavily stamped legal document. The deputy informed him that his property was officially under immediate foreclosure due to catastrophic default, and that he had exactly 15 minutes to gather a single bag of personal belongings and vacate the premises permanently. Maya came running down the stairs, screaming hysterically at the sight of the bailiffs walking right past her husband and beginning to document their expensive furniture. Exactly 10 miles away, in a wealthy suburban subdivision, a nearly identical scene was violently unfolding at Darren and Chloe's house. Chloe opened her front door to find a team of bailiffs and county sheriffs standing on her welcome mat. She immediately went into a complete unhinged frenzy. She screamed at the officers at the top of her lungs. She pointed her finger aggressively in their faces, loudly declaring that she was a licensed real estate professional and that they were violating her fundamental property rights. She threatened to sue the entire county for trespassing. The officers completely ignored her screaming. They pushed past her and began systematically changing the locks on the exterior doors. Darren stood in the background, completely paralyzed by fear, watching the tow truck operators drag his expensive luxury utility vehicle out of the garage. He tried to argue that they needed 30 days of legal notice, but the bailiff shoved the predatory loan contract into his shaking hands. The bailiff calmly explained that by signing the high-risk equity transfer, they legally waived their right to a standard eviction period. Back at the townhouse, Trent was frantically reading through the heavy legal binder the deputy had handed him. He was breathing heavily, trying to find a legal loophole or a technical error that would stop the bailiffs from carrying his television out the front door. Maya was crying loudly, begging the officers to stop claiming that there had to be a mistake with their bank. Trent flipped to the final page of the foreclosure order. He looked at the section identifying the primary creditor. He expected to see the name Apex Horizon Financial Solutions. Instead, his bloodshot eyes locked onto a completely different corporate entity. The primary lien holder was officially listed as Beatrice Holdings. Trent stopped breathing. His hands began to shake so violently that the heavy legal documents rattled loudly in the quiet foyer. He looked down at the signature line identifying the Supreme Chairman and sole executive beneficiary. The name was printed in bold black ink: Roland Sinclair. The absolute horror of the situation crashed down upon Trent like a massive physical weight. All the color completely drained from his face. His legs gave out, and he collapsed onto the bottom step of his expensive wooden staircase. He realized that the anonymous predatory financial company that saved him from the violent loan sharks was entirely controlled by me. He realized that the money he used to pay off the mob was my money. He realized that he had willingly signed away the legal rights to his home and his vehicles directly to the elderly black man he violently assaulted. Maya looked over his trembling shoulder and read my name on the legal document. She let out a loud, agonizing wail of pure despair. She finally understood that her father literally owned every single aspect of her pathetic existence, and he was currently repossessing it all. Across town, Chloe was experiencing the exact same horrifying realization. She was reading her own copy of the foreclosure documents while standing barefoot on her front lawn. When she read the name Beatrice Holdings, she physically stopped screaming. Her arrogant, entitled demeanor completely evaporated into thin air. Darren walked over to her and looked at the paperwork. He saw his late mother's name staring back at him. He saw my signature verifying the destruction of his financial life. Darren dropped to his knees right there on the wet morning grass. He clutched his stomach as if he had been physically stabbed. He knew exactly what this meant. There was absolutely no legal defense. There was no escaping this trap. I had meticulously purchased their debts, waited for them to publicly humiliate themselves, and then immediately pulled the heavy iron chains tight around their necks. The county sheriffs did not care about their emotional breakdowns. They had a specific legal job to do, and they executed it with cold professional efficiency. The deputies gave Trent and Maya exactly 15 minutes to pack a single duffel bag of basic clothing. When Trent tried to pack his expensive designer watches, the bailiff physically snatched them out of his hands, informing him that all luxury assets within the property now legally belonged to the creditor. They were marched out of their own front door in front of all their wealthy, judgmental neighbors. The neighbors stood on their perfectly manicured lawns, holding their morning coffees, watching the arrogant technology bro and his superficial wife get violently thrown out onto the street like common criminals. At Darren and Chloe's house, the scene was equally humiliating. Chloe was forced to walk down her driveway carrying a plastic garbage bag filled with socks and cheap shirts. Her wealthy suburban friends watched from their windows as the sheriff permanently padlocked the front door. I watched the simultaneous, beautifully coordinated evictions on my secure tablet. I took a slow, satisfying sip of my hot coffee. Just 2 weeks ago, on a freezing, rainy November night, they stood in my bedroom and coldly demanded that I get out of my own house. They handed me a cheap garbage bag and forced me into the storm. They felt incredibly powerful in that moment. They thought throwing an old man onto the street was a brilliant business decision. Now the universe had fully returned their malicious energy with absolutely zero mercy. They were standing on the cold concrete sidewalks with nothing but the clothes on their backs. They had no money, no credit, no cars, and nowhere to go. They were forced to experience the exact same terrifying, helpless nightmare they casually inflicted upon me. The only difference was that when I walked out of my door, I took $50 million with me. When they walked out of theirs, they took absolutely nothing but their own miserable, inescapable shame. Exactly 14 days had passed since the morning the county sheriffs permanently locked my children out of their beautiful suburban homes. 14 days is a very short amount of time in the grand scheme of a human life, but it is an absolute eternity when you are falling rapidly down a bottomless black hole. My private investigator provided me with a highly detailed, comprehensive report regarding their exact movements during those miserable 2 weeks. The 4 of them were currently crammed into a single, incredibly filthy room at a cheap roadside motel located right off the busy interstate highway. It was the kind of miserable, decaying establishment that rented rooms by the hour to transient strangers. The faded floral wallpaper was peeling away from the damp walls in long, ugly strips. The stained industrial carpet smelled heavily of stale cigarette smoke mildew and cheap cleaning chemicals. A massive neon sign buzzed loudly right outside their single cracked window, casting a harsh, blinking red light across the cramped living space every few seconds. They were forced to sleep in shifts on 2 sagging, highly uncomfortable beds. But sleep was completely impossible anyway. The cheap mattresses were heavily infested with bedbugs. Every single morning they woke up with angry red bite marks covering their arms and legs. Maya spent hours sitting on the edge of the filthy porcelain bathtub, crying softly as she aggressively scratched her irritated skin. She was a deeply superficial woman who used to spend thousands of dollars on luxury skincare routines and imported cosmetics. Now she was washing her face with a cracked bar of cheap motel soap and drying her hands on a stiff, scratchy towel. Darren sat on the floor in the dark corner of the room, staring blankly at the dirty baseboards. He was wearing the exact same designer clothes he had on the day of the violent eviction. His expensive silk shirt was heavily stained and terribly wrinkled. His premium leather shoes were scuffed and covered in highway dirt. He looked like a completely broken, entirely defeated man. Their financial ruin was absolute and totally inescapable. They had zero emergency savings because they had lived their entire adult lives completely reliant on my secret financial support. When Beatrice Holdings officially executed the massive foreclosure protocols, their personal bank accounts were completely frozen by the legal authorities. Their high-limit credit cards were instantly declined everywhere they went. They had exactly $42 in loose cash between the 4 of them. They had to pool their remaining coins together just to survive on cheap, greasy fast food and stale convenience store bread. Finding new employment was entirely impossible. The spectacular public execution I had delivered at the charity gala had effectively destroyed their professional lives forever. The crystal-clear videos of their extreme elder abuse and calculated financial fraud were permanently etched into the digital memory of the internet. Every single time a potential employer searched their names online, they were immediately greeted by thousands of news articles and viral videos detailing their horrible crimes. Chloe tried to apply for a basic administrative job at a small unknown real estate office across town. The hiring manager recognized her face immediately. He actually laughed directly at her and told her to leave the building before he called the police. Trent sent out dozens of desperate emails from his phone to his former technology investors begging for a minor consulting role just to put food on the table. Every single email bounced back or was entirely ignored. They were completely toxic. They were social and professional pariahs in the very city they used to confidently rule. Extreme poverty and intense physical hunger will quickly destroy any fake alliances built entirely on greed. The heavy tension inside the cramped, freezing motel room finally boiled over into outright psychological violence on a Tuesday afternoon. Trent was pacing back and forth across the narrow space between the 2 sagging beds. He was furiously tapping the cracked screen of his cell phone, cursing loudly about the lack of a stable internet connection. Chloe was sitting on the edge of the mattress, glaring at him with pure, unadulterated hatred in her tired eyes. "This is all your fault!" Chloe suddenly hissed, her voice dripping with intense venom and deep resentment. "You just had to play the big technology visionary. You had to borrow $500,000 from violent criminals to fund your stupid, imaginary crypto empire. If you had not racked up that massive life-threatening debt, we would have never been forced to forge those property deeds. We would still be living comfortably in our beautiful houses." Trent stopped pacing and spun around to face her. His face turned bright red with defensive, explosive rage. "Do not you dare put this massive failure on me," Trent shouted, stepping aggressively toward her. "You were the licensed real estate agent. You were the one who confidently told us the forged signature would hold up in a court of law. You are the one who brought those corporate cash buyers right into the living room and completely triggered the old man into fighting back. You are a massive, incompetent failure, Chloe. You could not even sell a fake house properly." Chloe stood up abruptly, her fists clenched tightly at her sides. She looked like she was completely ready to physically attack him.
"I am a failure," she screamed, her voice echoing loudly through the thin motel walls and out into the parking lot. "I am not the one who begged the old man for grocery money while pretending to be a self-made millionaire on the internet. You are pathetic, Trent. You dragged all of us down into the filthy gutter because you wanted to play a high-stakes financial game you did not even understand." The screaming match escalated incredibly rapidly. They viciously tore into each other, ripping away years of fake politeness and exposing their absolute mutual disgust. They blamed each other for the failed legal conservatorship, the highly fraudulent loans, and the humiliating public exposure at the charity gala. They pointed fingers over the corrupt doctor and the massive social media scandal. They were like two starving rats trapped inside a dark metal cage, aggressively cannibalizing each other just to survive one more miserable day. Darren watched them scream from his spot on the dirty floor. He did not have the physical energy to join the loud argument. His stomach was cramping painfully from extreme hunger. He had not eaten a proper warm meal in 3 entire days. He looked over at his sister. Maya was sitting on the floor near the bathroom door, hugging her knees tightly against her chest. She looked completely hollowed out, entirely depleted of her usual vanity and superficial arrogance. "Stop it," Darren finally said, his voice incredibly weak and highly raspy. "Just stop screaming at each other. It does not matter whose fault it is anymore. The money is completely gone. The houses are gone. We have absolutely nothing left to fight over." Trent and Chloe stopped yelling and looked down at Darren. The heavy, suffocating silence that followed his words was far more depressing than their aggressive shouting. The bitter, freezing reality of their situation was completely undeniable. They were entirely defeated by their own catastrophic choices. "We are going to die out here," Maya whispered, a single tear rolling down her dirty cheek. "We cannot afford another night in this terrible room. The motel manager already told us he is kicking us out tomorrow morning because our final payment declined. We are going to be sleeping on the cold concrete sidewalk. We are going to be those exact same homeless people we used to ignore on the street." Darren slowly shook his head. He placed his hands flat against the cold floor and forced himself to stand up. His knees trembled slightly from extreme physical weakness and lack of nutrition. "We are not going to sleep on the street," Darren said, looking at the three of them with a look of total agonizing defeat. "There is only one person in this entire world who can stop this nightmare. There is only one person who has the absolute power to turn the lights back on." Trent scoffed loudly and crossed his arms over his chest. "Are you seriously suggesting we go crawling back to him?" Trent asked, his toxic pride still trying to fight against his basic survival instincts. "He is the exact person who put us in this filthy room. He completely destroyed our entire lives on live television. He hates us. He put us here because we actively tried to steal his entire fortune and throw him into an asylum," Chloe muttered quietly, finally accepting her undeniable role in their absolute destruction. "He is my father," Darren said softly, looking down at his dirty, calloused hands. "We pushed him into the freezing rain and he fought back. He completely won the war. We have absolutely no leverage left. We have no legal standing. We have no money. We have to go to his corporate office and we have to beg for our miserable lives. It is our only remaining option if we want to survive the winter." It took them over an hour to gather the necessary courage to leave the motel room. They had to swallow every single ounce of their toxic pride and deeply ingrained arrogance. They walked out into the cold, windy afternoon and made their way toward the busy highway intersection. They did not have the money to call a premium ride-sharing service. They did not have their luxury sports vehicles. They had to count their loose coins and stand at the public city bus stop. They waited for 30 minutes in the freezing wind. Cars drove past them, splashing dirty street water onto their ruined clothes. When the loud, crowded city bus finally arrived, they climbed aboard in total silence. They sat in the very back of the bus, completely surrounded by the working-class citizens they used to look down upon. The ride into the downtown corporate district took over an entire hour. The heavy bus stopped at every single city block, jolting them back and forth. They kept their heads down desperately, hoping nobody on the public transit system would recognize their faces from the viral internet videos. It was the most physically and emotionally humiliating journey of their entire lives. When they finally stepped off the bus in the center of the financial district, they looked up at the towering glass skyscrapers surrounding them. They walked slowly toward the massive state-of-the-art corporate headquarters of Beatrice Holdings. The building was a towering monument to absolute wealth and institutional power. It was everything they had ever wanted, completely locked away behind thick, impenetrable security glass. They walked through the revolving front doors into the immaculate climate-controlled lobby. The floors were made of pristine white marble. Men and women in sharp, expensive business suits walked briskly past them, carrying leather briefcases and discussing massive corporate deals. My children stood right in the center of the beautiful lobby, looking like absolute garbage. Their clothes were wrinkled and heavily stained. They smelled like a cheap motel room. They looked like lost, frightened trespassers in a world they used to confidently claim as their own. They approached the polished security desk with incredibly heavy steps, completely ready to surrender their final shred of dignity just to secure a warm meal and a safe place to sleep. I sat behind a massive desk carved from solid dark mahogany. My corner office was located on the absolute top floor of the corporate headquarters of Beatrice Holdings. The walls were made entirely of floor-to-ceiling glass, offering a breathtaking, unobstructed view of the sprawling Atlanta skyline. The afternoon sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting a warm, golden light across the city. The office was incredibly quiet. The thick, soundproof glass completely blocked out the noise of the bustling traffic hundreds of feet below. I held a custom ceramic mug in my right hand, taking slow, deliberate sips of my black coffee. The dark, bitter liquid tasted absolutely perfect. I looked at the sleek digital clock resting on my desk. I knew they were currently standing in the lobby. My head of security had already called my private line to inform me that 4 incredibly disheveled individuals claiming to be my family were begging the front desk for 5 minutes of my time. I instructed my security chief to let them through the security gates. I wanted them to ride the private glass elevator all the way to the top. I wanted them to physically ascend into the very heart of the massive empire they had so foolishly tried to steal. The heavy double doors of my office were made of frosted glass and solid steel. They slowly swung open, revealing the 4 people who had completely destroyed their own lives. They stepped tentatively onto the plush, deep gray carpet of my executive suite. The physical contrast between their current state and the immaculate luxury of the room was absolutely staggering. They looked like terrified refugees wandering into a royal palace. Darren was wearing the exact same designer shirt he had worn on the day of his eviction, but it was now completely covered in dark stains and terrible wrinkles. Maya was hugging her own arms, her face gaunt, her expensive hair extensions tangled and completely ruined. Trent, the man who used to strut around like a billionaire technology visionary, was slouching forward with his head hung low, completely stripped of his unearned arrogance. Chloe looked absolutely hollowed out, her skin pale and covered in small, angry red bites from the cheap motel mattress. The faint, undeniable smell of cheap convenience store food and stale cigarette smoke followed them into the pristine, climate-controlled air of my office. They stopped in the center of the room. They looked around at the expensive modern art on the walls, the massive glass windows, and the sheer, undeniable power radiating from every single corner of the space. Then they looked at me. I did not stand up to greet them. I did not offer them a seat. I simply rested my hands flat on my mahogany desk and stared at them with a look of absolute freezing indifference. The heavy silence in the room stretched out for a very long time, actively suffocating them, forcing them to confront the immense gravity of their catastrophic failures. Suddenly, Darren took a shaky step forward. His legs completely gave out beneath him. He dropped directly to his knees right there on the plush carpet. He did not trip. He willingly collapsed in an act of total pathetic surrender. The second Darren hit the floor, the rest of them immediately followed. Maya fell to her knees beside her brother, burying her face in her dirty hands and sobbing uncontrollably. Trent and Chloe sank to the ground, bowing their heads in absolute disgrace. The four adults who had arrogantly plotted to lock me inside a psychiatric ward were now physically prostrating themselves before me like starving peasants begging a king for a single crust of bread. Dad Darren choked out his voice, cracking and breaking with intense, pathetic desperation. "We are so incredibly sorry. We were completely wrong. We made a horrible, catastrophic mistake." I took another slow sip of my coffee. I did not say a single word. I wanted him to speak. I wanted him to empty every single ounce of his toxic pride right onto the floor of my office. "Please, Dad." Darren cried out, tears streaming rapidly down his dirty face. "You have to save us. We have absolutely nothing left. We are sleeping in a filthy motel infested with insects. We are starving. We cannot find jobs. The whole world hates us. We know we hurt you, but we are your family. We are blood after all. You cannot just leave your own blood to die in the street. Please save us. I do not want to live in that slum anymore." Maya lifted her head, her face completely soaked with tears. "Daddy, please," she wailed loudly, abandoning any remaining shred of her vanity. "We will do anything you want. We will work for you. We will pay back every single penny we owe you. Just please stop the foreclosures. Please give us our lives back. I cannot take another night in that horrible place." Trent and Chloe were openly weeping on the floor. Trent brought his hands together as if he was actively praying to me. "Roland, I am begging you," Trent sobbed, his voice high-pitched and entirely broken. "I was a complete fool. I was arrogant and stupid. Please, just forgive us. Give us a second chance to prove we can be a real family." They were crying so loudly that their wails echoed against the thick glass windows. They genuinely believed that witnessing their intense physical suffering would somehow melt my heart. They thought that appealing to our biological connection would magically erase the fact that they had actively conspired to destroy my sanity and steal my entire fortune. They still did not understand the man sitting across from them. They thought I was a soft, forgiving father who could be easily manipulated by a few desperate tears. I carefully placed my coffee mug down on the wooden desk. The small, sharp clink of the ceramic hitting the mahogany instantly silenced their loud sobbing. They looked up at me with wide, desperate eyes, eagerly waiting for me to offer them a lifeline. They waited for me to tell them that the punishment was finally over, that the lesson had been learned, and that they could go back to their comfortable, privileged lives. I leaned forward slightly in my heavy leather executive chair. I looked deeply into Darren's tear-filled eyes, then at Maya, then at Trent, and finally at Chloe. My face was a completely unreadable mask of solid stone. 2 weeks ago, I said, my voice incredibly low, perfectly smooth, and completely devoid of any human warmth. 2 weeks ago, on a freezing, rainy November night, you stood in my personal bedroom. You threw my clothing onto the hardwood floor inside a cheap plastic garbage bag. You looked me directly in the eyes and you forcefully evicted me from the home I built with my own 2 hands. I paused, letting the heavy reality of my words settle completely over their kneeling bodies. Darren flinched as if I had physically struck him. Maya looked down at the carpet in absolute shame. When you threw me out into that freezing rain, I continued speaking slowly and deliberately so they would hear every single syllable. Did you think about blood in that exact moment? Did you think about family when you forged a legal deed to steal my property? Did you think about our biological connection when you handed $10,000 to a corrupt doctor to lock me inside a mental asylum? Darren opened his mouth to speak, to offer some pathetic, useless excuse, but I immediately raised my right hand, silencing him entirely. Do not dare speak to me about blood. I commanded, my voice growing slightly louder, carrying the terrifying, absolute authority of a man who held their entire existence in the palm of his hand. Blood does not give you a magical right to betray the people who love you. Blood does not excuse extreme calculated malice. It only makes your betrayal that much more disgusting. You did not come here today because you suddenly realized the moral error of your ways. You did not come here because you actually love me. You came here entirely because you are hungry, you are broke, and you are finally experiencing the exact same helpless terror that you joyfully tried to inflict upon me. The room fell into a dead, suffocating silence. The air was incredibly heavy. They realized in that exact moment that their tears were completely useless. Their desperate begging was falling upon deaf ears. The father they thought they could endlessly manipulate was permanently gone, replaced entirely by a ruthless corporate executioner. I looked down at the four miserable creatures kneeling on my floor. I felt absolutely no satisfaction in seeing them cry. I felt no joy in their physical deterioration. But I also felt absolutely zero pity. Pity is reserved for innocent people who fall victim to unfortunate, unpredictable circumstances. These four individuals were the sole architects of their own spectacular destruction. They had greedily built a massive bonfire, eagerly poured gasoline all over it, and were now crying because their hands were severely burned by the flames. "You beg for a second chance," I said, leaning back into my leather chair, folding my hands neatly in my lap. "You ask me to simply wave my hand and magically restore the beautiful homes, the luxury cars, and the comfortable lives you completely took for granted. You want me to erase the consequences of your own malicious actions. But the universe does not work that way, and neither does Beatrice Holdings." Chloe let out a soft, agonizing whimper, covering her mouth with her shaking hands. Trent closed his eyes, completely unable to meet my gaze. They were finally beginning to understand the absolute finality of their situation. They had walked into my office hoping for a grand, emotional reconciliation. They were instead receiving a cold, calculated reading of their permanent sentence. "You looked at an elderly man and saw nothing but a dollar sign." I told them smoothly the truth of my words, striking them like physical blows. "You actively calculated the exact monetary value of my premature death. You celebrated when you thought I was legally trapped. You smiled when you thought I was completely destroyed. The only reason you are currently on your knees is because you realized you brought a plastic knife to a nuclear war. You are not sorry for what you did to me. You are only sorry that you completely failed to get away with it." I let the silence return to the massive glass office. The golden sunlight of the late afternoon continued to pour through the windows, illuminating the dust motes floating in the air above their bowed heads. They were completely defeated. They had played their absolute final card, the desperate emotional appeal to family blood, and I had effortlessly ripped it into a million tiny pieces right in front of their faces. They had absolutely nothing left to offer me. They had no leverage, no pride, and no hope. They were completely empty, hollowed-out shells of the arrogant, greedy predators they used to be. I stared at the four of them for a few more long, agonizing minutes. I wanted to burn this exact visual image into my memory forever. I wanted to remember the exact posture of their absolute submission. I wanted to remember the sound of their shallow, panicked breathing echoing in my quiet office. This was the ultimate culmination of my entire strategic response to their brutal betrayal. They had willingly walked into my corporate fortress and thrown themselves at my mercy. But mercy was a luxury I simply could no longer afford to give them. If I saved them today, they would only learn that their actions had no permanent consequences. They would simply retreat into the shadows, lick their wounds, and patiently wait for another opportunity to strike me when my back was turned. I could never allow that to happen. The lesson had to be absolute. The punishment had to be entirely permanent. I took one final slow sip of my dark coffee, feeling the bitter warmth slide down my throat. The time for talking and begging was officially over. It was time to hand them the final verdict. The heavy, suffocating silence in the top-floor executive office felt absolute. Darren, Maya, Trent, and Chloe remained kneeling on the plush gray carpet, their faces tilted downward in total defeat. They had poured every single ounce of their fake remorse onto the floor, completely exhausting their arsenal of manipulation. They were waiting for me to speak, waiting for the loving, forgiving father they used to easily exploit to magically reappear and rescue them from their self-inflicted misery. But that man was completely gone. In his place sat the supreme chairman of Beatrice Holdings, a man who had successfully orchestrated the total and unmitigated destruction of their fraudulent lives. I looked at their trembling shoulders and their dirty, ruined clothing. I felt the cold, hard surface of my mahogany desk under my fingertips. I slowly reached down and opened the heavy bottom drawer on the right side of my desk. The smooth, sliding sound of the metal tracks cutting through the dead silence of the room caused Trent to physically flinch. He probably thought I was pulling out another massive stack of predatory loan documents, or perhaps a legal contract that would strip away their final remaining human rights. Darren slowly lifted his tear-stained face, his bloodshot eyes tracking my movements with desperate, hungry anticipation. He was still holding onto a tiny microscopic shred of hope that I was going to hand them a blank check to make the pain go away. He still genuinely believed that deep down I was weak enough to fold under the immense pressure of their manufactured suffering. I pulled 2 thin manila folders from the dark drawer and placed them flat on the center of my desk. I did not slide the folders toward them. I left them resting right in the middle of the polished wood, forcing my children to look at them from their humiliating position on the floor. I folded my hands together and leaned forward. "You came into this building today begging for a second chance," I said, my voice cutting through the quiet air like a sharpened steel blade. "You begged me for a way to survive the upcoming winter. You begged me to put food in your stomachs and a roof over your heads. You claimed you were completely willing to do absolutely anything I asked of you." Darren nodded his head rapidly, his eyes absolutely glued to the manila folders. "Yes, Dad." Darren whispered, his voice incredibly hoarse. "We will do anything. Just tell us what those papers are. We will sign them right now. We will work off our debts." Trent swallowed hard and shifted his weight on his bruised knees. "Please," Roland Trent pleaded, staring greedily at the folders. "Are those consulting contracts? Are you putting us on the corporate payroll? I can help manage the digital infrastructure of your foundation. Chloe knows real estate. We can be useful to your operations. We can earn our keep." I let out a low, humorless laugh that echoed coldly against the glass walls. "You truly have not learned a single thing about the reality of your situation," I said, shaking my head slowly. "You genuinely think you are walking out of this office with executive titles and a generous corporate salary. You think I would ever trust you to manage a single digital byte or a single square inch of property for my charitable foundation. You prove to the entire world that you are completely incompetent, highly corrupt, and utterly devoid of basic human morality. I would not trust you to manage a child's lemonade stand." I picked up the first manila folder and casually tossed it across the desk so that it landed right at Darren's dirty knees. I tossed the second folder so it landed directly in front of Trent. "Open them," I commanded. Darren and Trent scrambled desperately on the floor, their shaking fingers fumbling with the simple cardboard flaps. They ripped the folders open, their eyes scanning the printed legal text with frantic, starving energy. Maya and Chloe leaned over their shoulders, equally desperate to see the magical financial lifeline I was throwing them. I watched the exact moment their desperate anticipation violently crashed into the brutal, unyielding wall of reality. The tiny sparks of hope in their eyes were instantly extinguished, completely replaced by pure, unadulterated horror and intense physical revulsion. Trent dropped the papers onto the carpet as if they had physically burned his hands. Darren stared at the contract, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. "Those are standard entry-level employment contracts for the Beatrice Foundation," I explained smoothly, thoroughly enjoying the look of absolute devastation painting their faces. "They are not executive positions. They are not consulting roles. They are official employment agreements for the overnight janitorial staff. If you sign those papers today, you will be handed a mop, a bucket of bleach, and a scrub brush. You will spend 8 hours every single night cleaning the public toilets, scrubbing the dirty floors, and taking out the heavy trash bags for the young black entrepreneurs you so deeply despise. You will earn the exact state minimum wage and not a single penny more. You will be supervised by strict managers who already know exactly who you are and what you have done." Chloe let out a loud, hysterical gasp. She fell backward onto the floor, shaking her head aggressively. "No," Chloe screamed, her voice completely cracking. "No, I am not a maid. I am a licensed real estate professional. I cannot clean toilets. I will not scrub floors for minimum wage. You cannot legally force us to do this." I leaned back in my heavy leather chair and looked down at her with absolute freezing contempt. "I am not forcing you to do anything, Chloe," I replied calmly. "You are completely free to walk right out the front doors of this building and go back to your infested motel room. You are completely free to starve on the cold concrete streets. But if you want to eat a warm meal, if you want to earn a legitimate paycheck to keep yourselves from freezing to death this winter, you are going to put on a cheap uniform and you are going to scrub the physical filth off the floors of my building. You want to survive. Then you are going to clean up the trash you created yourselves. It is the only honest work you are entirely qualified to perform." Maya began to weep loudly, rocking back and forth on her knees. "Daddy, please do not do this to us," she wailed, her voice echoing pathetically. "We cannot live on minimum wage. We have massive debts. We have nothing. Please just give us a small advance on our inheritance. Just give us a tiny fraction of what we are supposed to get when you pass away. We promise we will disappear and never bother you again." Her words perfectly highlighted the exact depth of her incurable delusion. She still believed she was entitled to my wealth. She still believed the money was rightfully hers to claim. I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored suit jacket and pulled out a single heavily notarized piece of thick parchment paper. I unfolded it slowly and held it up so they could see the official legal stamps and the signatures at the bottom. "You are holding out hope for a future payday that simply does not exist," I told them, making sure my words penetrated the deepest, darkest corners of their greedy minds. "This is the finalized, certified, and legally binding copy of my last will and testament. It was officially filed and heavily secured by a massive team of estate lawyers earlier this morning. In this specific document, the names Darren Sinclair, Maya Sinclair, Trent, and Chloe do not appear a single time. I have explicitly legally disinherited all four of you. Furthermore, I have included an ironclad clause specifically blocking you from ever challenging this document in a court of law. If I die tomorrow, or if I die 20 years from now, you will not receive a single dime. You will not receive a single piece of old furniture. You are permanently erased from my estate. You are entirely dead to my legacy." Darren let out a sound that was half sob, half agonizing scream. He slammed his fists onto the carpet, completely broken by the absolute finality of my declaration. There was no secret trust fund waiting for them. There was no magical reconciliation. There was only a minimum wage janitorial contract resting on the floor and a lifetime of inescapable poverty stretching out before them. They had gambled their entire existence on a violent, desperate attempt to steal my house, and they had lost absolutely everything. "I am completely done looking at you," I said, my voice dropping to a low, authoritative command. "You have your employment contracts. Sign them or leave them on the floor. I do not care what you decide. But your 5 minutes are officially up." Darren tried to reach his hand out toward my desk, desperately trying to grab the edge of the mahogany wood. "Dad, wait!" Darren pleaded, his face covered in a mixture of snot and tears. "Please, you cannot just throw us away like this. We are sorry. We are so sorry." I did not bother to answer him. I simply raised my right hand into the air and snapped my fingers twice. The heavy, frosted glass doors of my office instantly swung open. 4 massive, heavily armed security operators stepped into the room. They were the exact same former military contractors who had flattened Darren and Trent against the asphalt in the dark parking garage. They moved with terrifying silent efficiency. Before my children could even register what was happening, the operators grabbed them aggressively by the backs of their stained collars and the arms of their ruined jackets. Trent and Darren were hoisted violently into the air. Maya and Chloe were dragged forcefully to their feet. "No," Maya screamed, kicking her legs wildly as a massive guard hauled her toward the door. "Let me go. Please, Daddy, do not let them do this." Darren was sobbing hysterically, reaching his hands out toward me as the security team physically dragged him backward across the plush carpet. Trent was completely limp, entirely paralyzed by the sheer physical force removing him from the premises. I sat perfectly still in my leather chair, watching them being violently pulled out of my sanctuary. The heavy glass doors slammed shut behind them, abruptly cutting off their agonizing, desperate screams. The sound of their wailing faded rapidly down the long hallway as they were dragged toward the freight elevators, completely exiled from my life forever. The absolute silence that returned to my executive office was incredibly beautiful. It was the sound of total, unmitigated peace. The toxic infection that had plagued my family for decades was finally and permanently excised. I slowly stood up from my heavy mahogany desk and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling glass windows. The sun had finally set over the city of Atlanta. The sprawling metropolis was illuminated by millions of glowing lights stretching out into the dark horizon as far as the eye could see. I reached into my chest pocket and pulled out the small, framed photograph of my beautiful wife, Beatrice. I gently touched my thumb to her smiling face, feeling a deep, profound warmth spreading through my chest. I traced the edges of the silver frame, remembering the very first day we bought that empty plot of dirt. We had nothing but a shared dream and an unbreakable bond. She always knew our sacrifices would eventually change the world. She just never knew that protecting that dream would require me to become completely ruthless. But as I stood there in the quiet solitude of my towering glass fortress, I knew she would be incredibly proud of the man I had to become. I had successfully defended her incredible vision. I had fiercely protected the massive empire we had sacrificed so much to build together. The $40 million foundation would change the lives of thousands of brilliant, deserving young people who actually possessed the work ethic and the moral integrity that our own children entirely lacked. Our true legacy was fully secured, completely safe from the greedy, grasping hands of the violent parasites I had finally cast out into the dark. I looked out at the glowing city, took a deep, cleansing breath of the quiet air, and smiled. The war was officially over. I had completely won. Family is not simply defined by the blood running through your veins. It is instead forged by true loyalty, deep gratitude, and mutual respect. When extreme greed overrides basic decency, the very title of family is instantly revoked. True power does not lie in a massive bank account, but in the quiet discipline of holding toxic people entirely accountable for their ruthless actions. Never, ever weaponize your compassion to protect those who would easily discard you for $1. Let them experience the severe consequences of their betrayal. Ultimately, true peace is found not in forgiving monsters, but in walking away with your absolute dignity intact. If you enjoyed this story, please make sure to like this video, leave a comment down below sharing your thoughts on how Roland handled his family, and subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories of absolute justice.